time stresses, stories heal. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to True Horror Stories Film. I'm Alex. If you're lying there staring at the ceiling, feeling the crushing weight of tomorrow pressing down on your chest, I need you to take a slow, deep breath. Let it out. You don't have to fight this loneliness alone tonight. I've prepared tonight's journey in my digital studio to create a completely unbroken, seamless wall of calm around you. Subscribe and leave a like if you need this sanctuary tonight, and tell me in the comments what's occupying your heart. Let's explore the dark together. Story 1. Every frame she left. Mara Voss came to Cray's Landing, Maine, to document a woman who disappeared 12 years ago and was never found. Sadie Pelletier was 26 years old when she vanished from a harbor's edge on a September night, and the investigating officer closed the case 14 months later with a finding of accidental drowning and the phrase limited credibility applied to every witness who said they had seen her after she was supposed to be dead. Mara came to ask the right questions. She did not expect the subject to start answering them before she had finished asking. Sadie Pelletier is in the background of Mara's photographs. Not one photograph. Not a coincidence that can be explained by a stranger who happened to be passing through the frame at the wrong moment. She is in the backgrounds of photographs taken at 3 separate locations across 7 days, always at the edge of the frame, always still, always with her attention directed at the camera, always in a place where no one was standing when Mara pressed the shutter. The case was closed. Sadie did not get the message, and the longer Mara looks at the frames, the more she understands that Sadie is not haunting these photographs. She is using them. She has something to show Mara, something that the investigating officer with his limited credibility and his closed case file did not want found. And she has been waiting 12 years for a photographer good enough and stubborn enough and angry enough to finally look at the edges of the frame. This is not a ghost story. This is a missing persons case. The missing person is doing her own investigation. The project was called What the Water Kept, which I chose before I understood how accurate it was going to become. I am Mara Voss. I am 38 years old, and I have been a documentary photographer for 14 years, which means I have spent 14 years in the company of other people's worst experiences, learning how to be present with a camera in a way that serves the subject rather than the photographer, which is a discipline that sounds simple and is not simple, and that I have failed at enough times to know the precise texture of the failure. I photograph people who have been overlooked, women mostly, women whose stories were reported inadequately or not at all, whose disappearances were filed and not pursued, whose families were told things that were not true and were given paperwork instead of answers. I do this work because I am good at it, and because it matters, and because I have, for reasons I understood clearly when I began and understand differently now, a specific relationship with being overlooked that makes me useful to the women I photograph and the families I sit with and the communities I enter with my camera and my notebooks and my willingness to stay longer than anyone expects. The boathouse was on the eastern edge of a harbor called Cray's Landing, which is not a town exactly, but the kind of coastal Maine settlement that resists categorization. A post office, a fuel dock, a general store that also rents fishing equipment and sells bait and keeps irregular hours, a scatter of houses along the road from the county route, and a working harbor with 11 lobster boats and a population that has been declining since the 1980s and knows it and has decided to find this fact unremarkable. I had come to Cray's Landing because of a woman named Sadie Pelletier, who had disappeared from the harbor's edge in September of 2011, 12 years before my arrival, and whose case had been closed 14 months after her disappearance with a finding of accidental drowning, despite the fact that nobody had ever been recovered and several witnesses had reported seeing her in the days after her official disappearance date, which the investigating officer had characterized in his notes as unreliable testimony from individuals with limited credibility. I had read those notes 3 times before I drove to Maine. I had read the phrase limited credibility and thought about what it means for an investigating officer to decide, before interviewing a witness, what category of person they are and therefore how much weight their account will carry. And I had felt the specific anger that I have learned over 14 years to store in a part of myself that does not interfere with the work, but that is available when the work needs it. I arrived at Cray's Landing on the 14th of September. The boathouse was owned by a woman named Ruth Cray, a descendant of the family that had given the settlement its name, 70 years old, with the specific physical quality of coastal Maine women who have been outdoors in all weather for most of their lives, the kind of face that holds its lines honestly and without apology. She met me at the dock with the keys and a brief tour of the converted space, which was one large room on the water level, with a sleeping loft above and a small kitchen along the north wall and windows, on 3 sides that looked out over the harbor and the channel beyond it and the open Atlantic beyond that, the view expanding in stages from the particular to the enormous. She said, "The water makes noise at night, not loud but constant. Some people cannot sleep," I said. "I grew up near the water. I sleep better with it than without it." She said, "Good." She handed me the keys. "Sadie Pelletier was my neighbor's daughter," she said. "It is the way people in small communities say the names of their dead, directly and without preamble. Because in a community this size, the dead are never far from the surface of any conversation, and the preamble is a kind of disrespect. I am glad someone is finally here to ask the right questions." She left without elaborating on what the right questions were, which was its own kind of eloquence. I spent the first 3 days as I always spend the beginning of a project, which is in the mode of pure observation. No interviews, no formal documentation, just the accumulation of atmosphere and light and the specific sensory texture of the place. The smell of the harbor at different states of the tide, which ranged from the clean salt and cold of high water to the dark organic complexity of low tide, when the mud flats at the harbor's edge exposed themselves and released the specific smell of things that live at the boundary between sea and land, the smell of the intertidal, which is the smell of a zone that is neither one thing nor the other and is entirely itself, the sound of the lobster boats leaving before dawn, the specific percussion of diesel engines in cold water, the way the sound carried across the harbor and up through the boathouse floor in a vibration you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The light in September in coastal Maine, which is different from summer light and different from autumn light in the interior, softer and more amber and with a quality of finality. The light of a season that is preparing to hand off to something darker. I photographed all of it. The harbor in fog, the fuel dock in early morning, the general store's hand-lettered sign, the lobster traps stacked at the pier's edge in their weathered salt gray geometry. I did not begin looking at the frames until the evening of the 3rd day. I was at the table by the north window with my laptop and the first memory card of 3, running a preliminary cull, the standard first pass, where I separate the technically adequate from the technically inadequate and begin to feel the shape of what the project is going to be built from. I had a glass of wine and the harbor was dark outside the window and the water was making its constant low harbor noise, and I was in the specific pleasant tiredness of someone who has been outside and attentive for 3 days and is now resting with their eyes open. I culled through the fog frames and the fuel dock frames, and I was into the general store frames when I stopped. The frame was a wide shot of the store's exterior, taken on the second morning, the hand-lettered sign and the bait tanks outside, and the screen door with its wooden frame and its spring hinge visible at the left edge. In the right background, partially behind the corner of the building, there was a figure, a woman, or the suggestion of a woman, the resolution at that distance being sufficient to read gender in general proportion, but not detail. She was standing at the building's corner in a way that had the quality of someone who had stopped there rather than someone who was passing through. The posture of a person who is looking at something rather than moving toward or away from it. Her attention was directed toward the camera, toward me. I had been the only person in front of the store when I pressed the shutter. I noted the frame the way I always note anomalies and moved on. On the fourth morning, I went to meet the first of my interview subjects, a woman named Sadie Pelletier, who was Sadie's mother, and who had agreed after 3 months of correspondence to speak with me on record. She was 62, with the same directness that Ruth Cray had, the directness of people who have spent years saying a thing that no one was prepared to receive and have given up the softening preamble as an inefficiency. She lived in a house 300 yards from the harbor, in a room that was exactly as you would expect, the room of a woman who has spent 12 years fighting a closed case to look, with its stacks of documents and its corkboard of photographs and its specific, organized energy of sustained and unsatisfied urgency. She showed me photographs of Sadie. Sadie Pelletier had been 26 years old in September of 2011. In the photographs, she was dark-haired and sharp-featured, with the look of someone who was paying attention to more things at once than most people could track. In the most recent photograph, taken approximately 6 weeks before her disappearance, she was standing at the edge of the harbor, with the water behind her and her face turned slightly towards something outside the frame, and her expression was the expression of someone who has heard something they cannot quite locate. I photographed the photograph. I did not know yet that I had already photographed her. That knowledge came later, on the 7th evening, when I was doing the secondary review of the first week's frames, and I pulled up the general store exterior and zoomed to 100% on the figure at the building's corner, and I sat for a long time in the boathouse with the harbor dark outside, and the water making its low constant sound, and I looked at the face in the frame, and I looked at the photograph of the photograph on my secondary screen, and I understood what I was looking at. The figure at the corner of the general store, standing with her attention directed at my camera on a morning when I had been the only person in front of the building, was Sadie Pelletier, who had been missing for 12 years, who had been declared dead by accidental drowning in 2013, who was standing in the background of my photograph with the specific posture of a person who has stopped at the edge of something and is waiting to be seen. I sat in the boathouse for a long time, and I listened to the water, and I thought about 14 years of documentary work and the discipline of serving the subject rather than the photographer. And I thought about what it means when the subject finds you first. The second time I found her, I had not been looking. That is the detail I keep returning to, because it matters in the way that unsolicited information always matters more than solicited information in documentary work. It has not been shaped by the question. It has not been directed by what I thought I was looking for. It arrived on its own terms and from its own direction, and what arrives on its own terms is almost always more honest than what is drawn out. I had been in Cray's Landing for 9 days. I had conducted 3 interviews. Sadie Pelletier, who had given me 3 hours of testimony, and 2 boxes of documents she had compiled over 12 years of self-directed research into her daughter's disappearance. A man named Carl Bouchard, who had been one of the witnesses characterized as having limited credibility in the investigating officer's notes, and who turned out to be a retired marine biologist with a precise and detailed memory and a photographic recall of the specific circumstances of the sighting he had reported. And Ruth Cray, who had agreed to go on record after declining for 12 years on the grounds that she had not trusted anyone who had come to the story before me to handle it with the care it required. I photographed all three of them in their own spaces, which is my consistent practice, because a person in their own space is a different person from a person in a neutral space, and the difference is legible in the frame in ways that matter to the project and to the subject's dignity. I had also continued my ambient documentation of the harbor and the settlement, the daily accumulation of atmospheric and contextual imagery that would eventually form the connective tissue between the interview portraits and the documentary record, the photographs that said, "This is where it happened, and this is what it looks like to live in a place where something happened and was not resolved." On the 9th evening, I was reviewing the day's frames when I found her in the background of a photograph I had taken on the fuel dock at low tide. The fuel dock photograph was a wide establishing shot, the dock's wooden structure and the two boats tied at it, and the harbor beyond them and the mud flats visible at the water's edge where the tide was out, the specific low-tide landscape of a working harbor that most people only see from a distance and that has, up close, a kind of brutal beauty. The exposed machinery of the intertidal, the things that live in the boundary zone revealed in their full complicated reality. She was on the dock, standing at the far end of it, at the point where the dock's planking ended and the water or the mud flat at low tide began. The same posture as the general store frame, the quality of having stopped there rather than passing through, the attention directed toward my camera, toward me. In this frame, I could see more of her than in the first one, the resolution being better at this distance and in this light, and what I could see was consistent with the photographs Sadie Pelletier had shown to me, and the photograph of the photograph on my secondary screen. Dark hair, sharp features, the angle of a face that is paying attention to more than one thing at once. She was wearing a yellow rain jacket of the kind that fishermen and harbor workers wear, the heavy rubberized kind that is designed for weather rather than aesthetics, and the jacket was wet, not damp the way a jacket gets damp in harbor fog, wet the way a jacket gets wet when the person wearing it has been in the water. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went back through the 9 days of frames from the beginning, every image, every card, the full sequence, and I found her in 4 frames I had already culled and passed. She was in the background of Sadie Pelletier's kitchen, behind Donna's shoulder, visible through the window that looked out onto the small yard at the back of the house, standing at the yard's edge where the property met the scrubby coastal vegetation that ran down to the water. In that frame, she was at sufficient distance and in sufficient shadow that she read initially as a garden feature, a post or a stake, something vertical, and still that belonged in a yard at the edge of coastal property, which is why I had culled the frame without registering her presence. She was in the background of a frame I had taken at the harbor's boat ramp, a documentary shot of a lobster boat being hauled for maintenance, the mechanical lift and the smell of bilge water and anti-fouling paint that the photograph could not convey, but that had been present in the air when I pressed the shutter. She was at the edge of the parking area, beside a truck that had been there when I arrived and was still there when I left, and in this frame she was closer to the camera than in any of the others, and her face was turned at the angle that I had come to recognize, the 40-degree turn away from full face that meant I could see the jaw and the cheekbone and the line of the brow, but not quite the eyes. In the 4th recovered frame, which was a shot of the channel at dusk from the boathouse window, taken on the 5th evening, she was on the water, not in a boat, not on any visible structure. standing on the surface of the channel at the point where the harbor's sheltered water met the more open water beyond, at the boundary of the two, which was a place where the light at dusk did something specific and photogenic that I had been documenting across several evenings. The way the different water textures caught the amber light differently, the sheltered water flat and reflecting, and the open water moving and dispersing. She was standing at that boundary. I looked at the frame for a long time, and I thought about the yellow rain jacket, wet, and about the investigating officer's finding of accidental drowning, and about Carl Bouchard's sighting report and the phrase limited credibility. And I thought about Sadie Pelletier at 26 years old, and I thought about the boundary between the harbor water and the open water, which is also the boundary between the sheltered and the exposed, between the place where the boats stay and the place where the ocean begins. I called Donna Pelletier at 8 in the evening. She answered on the second ring, and I said, "I need to show you something. I need you to come to the boathouse, or I need to come to your house tonight, if possible, because what I have found in my photographs is something you need to see, and I do not want to describe it over the phone." She was at my door in 11 minutes. I showed her the 5 frames in sequence on the laptop at full resolution, and I sat beside her and watched her face while she looked at them, because a documentary photographer's job is always to watch the face, to read the information that the face contains before the person has decided what information to release. And what Donna Pelletier's face contained while she looked at the 5 frames was not surprise. It was recognition, and beneath the recognition, something that had the quality of confirmation, the specific expression of a person receiving information they had been waiting for and had been told for 12 years that they were wrong to expect. She said, "The jacket." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is the jacket she was wearing the night she disappeared, the yellow one. She bought it the summer before from the marine supply in Rockland. He had it." She stopped. The investigating officer. He had the jacket in the evidence log, and then it was gone. She paused. By the time I asked about it, 18 months after the case was closed, the evidence log showed it had been disposed of as part of the case closure. She looked at me. "A jacket does not disappear from an evidence log. Not by accident," I said. "Who was the investigating officer?" She said. "His name was Dennis Farrow. He retired from the county sheriff's office in 2015. He lives in Rockland." She said it the way she said everything, directly and without softening. The delivery of a woman who has been carrying this information for 12 years and has been waiting for someone to receive it properly. I looked at the 5 frames on the screen, and I thought about Sadie Pelletier standing at the boundary of the harbor water and the open water in a wet yellow jacket. And I thought about what it means to stand at a boundary. And I thought about the specific posture in every frame, the attention directed at the camera, at me, the quality of a person who is not haunting a place but is trying to communicate something to a specific person who has come to hear it. I thought about the fuel dock frame, the end of the dock where the planking stopped and the water began. Standing there with her attention on me and the jacket wet and the low-tide mud flats visible at the water's edge. I said, "She is showing me something." In each frame, she is in a specific location, not random. Each location is specific. Donna looked at me. I said, "I need to map them. The locations in the frames, the exact positions, the sight lines. I need to understand what she is pointing at." Donna said, "I will bring the documents tomorrow. Everything I have." 12 years of documents. She looked at the screen one more time, at her daughter standing at the boundary of the water in the amber September dusk. She said, very quietly, the specific quiet of a person saying something they have been waiting 12 years to say to someone who will understand it. "She is still working on it," I said. "I know." Donna left at 10, and I sat alone in the boathouse with the harbor making its low and constant sound outside the windows and the 5 frames open on the screen. And I looked at each position in each frame, and I began to draw a map. The map had 5 points. The points were not random. They formed a line. The line ran northeast. I had drawn it on the harbor chart that I found folded in the boathouse's kitchen drawer. The kind of nautical chart that working harbor communities keep in every building near the water as a matter of practical habit, showing the harbor's depth contours and the channel markers and the coastline in both directions from Cray's Landing, with the specific, functional detail of a document made for people who need to know exactly where things are, because the alternative is dangerous. I had plotted the 5 positions from my photographs as precisely as I could, without GPS coordinates, using the identifiable landmarks in each frame as reference points. The fuel dock's position relative to the harbor entrance, the general store's position on the settlement's main road, the boat ramp, the view from the boathouse window, Donna's backyard. 5 points. 5 locations where Sadie Pelletier had appeared in my frames, each one at the edge of the frame rather than the center, each one with her attention directed toward the camera, toward me, with the posture of a person who is not where they are by accident. The 5 points, plotted on the chart, formed a line that ran from the southwest corner of the harbor, where the general store sat at the road's edge, through the fuel dock, and the boat ramp and the boathouse window's sight line, and Donna's backyard at the water's edge, and extended northeast, out of the harbor, through the channel, and into the open water beyond. The line pointed somewhere. I sat at the table with the chart and a ruler, and I extended the line as far as the chart's coverage allowed, which was approximately 4 miles northeast of the harbor entrance, and at the point where the line terminated against the chart's edge, I noted the depth soundings, which were in the range of 60 to 80 feet, and the notation for a formation that the chart labeled with the standard symbol for a submerged obstruction. I did not know what was at that location. The chart's notation told me there was something there, something that the chart's makers had considered significant enough to mark as a hazard, but the chart did not tell me what it was or when it had been placed there, or how long it had been on the bottom. I wrote the coordinates in my notebook, and I went to bed, and I lay in the sleeping loft and listened to the harbor water below the boathouse, and I thought about lines and what they point at, and about the specific discipline of following evidence rather than interpretation, which is the discipline that distinguishes documentary work from storytelling, and which I have spent 14 years practicing, and which requires, above everything else, the willingness to let the evidence lead you somewhere you did not plan to go. Donna arrived at 8 in the morning with 2 banker's boxes. She carried them in from her truck without help. The efficient physical confidence of a woman accustomed to managing heavy things without assistance, and she set them on the table beside my laptop and my coffee and my chart, with its 5 plotted points and the ruler lying across the extended line, and she looked at the chart for a moment. She said, "You found the line." I said, "You already knew there was a line," she said. I knew where she was pointing. I have known her for 9 years. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table. The problem with knowing where something is pointing out when you are the mother of the missing person is that you are the person with the least credibility in the room. Whatever I said, whatever I found, whatever I documented, it came from me, which meant it came from grief, which meant it could be characterized as something other than evidence. She paused. I needed someone else to find the line, someone with no relationship to Sadie, someone whose documentation would not be dismissed. I said, "You knew I was coming here for 3 months while we were corresponding." She said, "Yes." I said, "You never mentioned the line or the location." "In 3 months of correspondence," she said, "No." She met my eyes steadily. "I needed you to find it yourself. If I had told you, your documentation would have been influenced by what I told you. and the line of influence would have been visible to anyone who wanted to characterize your findings as the product of a grieving mother's direction rather than independent documentary evidence. She paused. I needed the line to come from your camera, not from me. I looked at her across the table, at 62 years old and 12 years of organized, strategic, patient effort, building a case with the materials available to her, understanding from the beginning that her own relationship to the evidence was the evidence's greatest vulnerability, and working around that vulnerability with the discipline of someone who had realized early that she could not be the one who found what needed to be found. She had been waiting for a photographer. I said, "Tell me what is at the end of the line." She opened the first banker's box. She removed a folder and opened it and spread its contents on the table between us. Photocopies of marine salvage records, incident reports, a series of correspondence between a company called North Atlantic Marine Recovery and the Maine Department of Marine Resources, and a set of depth finder readings on printed paper that had the timestamp formatting of GPS-equipped sonar equipment. She said, "In 2014, a lobsterman named Pete Arsenal snagged his gear on something on the northeast approach to Cray's Landing Harbor in approximately 70 feet of water at a location that corresponds to the end of your line." She touched the sonar printouts. He reported it to the harbor master as a navigation hazard. The harbor master requested a marine survey. The marine survey identified the obstruction as a vehicle, a pickup truck, late 1990s model, resting on the bottom in approximately 72 feet of water. I said, "A truck," she said. "A 1998 Ford F-150, dark blue." She paused. Dennis Farrow, the investigating officer on Sadie's case, drove a 1998 Ford F-150, dark blue. She said it the way she said everything, directly, but there was something underneath the directness, something that had been compressed for a very long time, and was now, finally, in the presence of someone whose camera had independently confirmed the direction of everything she had spent 9 years knowing. I said, "The marine survey, what did it find in the truck?" She said, "Nothing." The survey was a navigation hazard assessment, not a criminal investigation. They photographed the exterior, confirmed the obstruction, flagged it for removal, and submitted their report to the Department of Marine Resources. She paused. The removal never happened. The file went into a bureaucratic process and stalled, and the truck was still on the bottom. I said, "The case was closed in 2013. The truck was found in 2014, she said, by a lobsterman who had no idea what it was, who reported it as a navigation hazard because that is what it was, and that is the kind of man Pete Arsenal is, a man who sees a hazard and reports it because that is what you do." She paused. If Farrow had known the truck was going to be found, he would have moved it somewhere deeper. I said, "You think Farrow put the truck there?" She said, "I think Sadie's case was closed before it was investigated because Farrow did not investigate it. And I think Farrow did not investigate it because he did not want to find what was in the water at the end of the northeast approach. And I think that truck is the reason." She looked at the chart with the 5 plotted points and the ruler lying across the extended line. Sadie knew something. She had been asking questions that last summer about the harbor, about the lobster operations, about some of the arrangements between the harbor master's office and certain boats that were using the fuel dock at hours that did not correspond to any fishing schedule. She had been talking to people. She paused. She talked to the wrong person. The harbor was making its morning sounds outside the boathouse windows. The lobster boat's out already. The water moving with the specific energy of a working harbor at full morning activity. The smell of diesel and salt and the low-tide mud that was beginning to be covered again as the tide came in. I sat at the table with the sonar printouts and the marine survey photographs and 12 years of Donna Pelletier's organized strategic patience. And I thought about Sadie at the fuel dock at hours that did not correspond to any fishing schedule, asking questions, noticing things. The face in the photographs with its quality of paying attention to more than one thing at once. I said, the witnesses who reported seeing her after her disappearance date. Carl Bouchard and the others. What specifically did they report? Donna went to the second box and removed another folder. She said Carl saw her on the dock at the fuel dock at approximately 6 in the morning, 4 days after her official disappearance date. She was wearing a yellow jacket. She appeared to be looking at something in the water. He spoke to her and she looked at him, and then she was not there. He described it to the investigating officer in precise terms, the specific terms of a marine biologist accustomed to accurate observation, and Farrow wrote limited credibility in his notes. She paused. The second witness was a woman named Helen Marsh, who saw Sadie at the harbor's boat ramp on a morning 6 days after the disappearance date. She was standing at the water's edge and looking northeast. Helen said she called out to her, and Sadie turned and looked at her for a moment, and then she was gone. I said, looking northeast. Donna said, yes. She looked at the chart. Helen did not know what northeast meant in that context. She reported what she saw. Farrow characterized her as distraught and emotionally compromised because she had been a friend of Sadie's, and he decided that friendship disqualified her testimony. I looked at the chart, the northeast approach, the fuel dock at 6 in the morning, standing at the water's edge looking northeast, 4 days after the disappearance date, and then 6 days, and then in the backgrounds of my photographs 12 years later, the same direction, the same attention, the same yellow jacket wet from water that should not have been accessible to a woman who had been declared dead. I thought about the 5 points and the line they formed, and the submerged truck at the end of it. I thought about Sadie standing at the boundary of the harbor water and the open water in the dusk frame, the boundary between the sheltered and the exposed, and about the specific quality of that position, standing exactly at the point where one kind of water became another kind, where the protected became the unprotected, where the harbor ended and the thing beyond the harbor began. I said, she is not showing me where she is showing me where to look. Donna said, yes. I said, she has been showing anyone who would look for 12 years. Carl Bouchard, Helen Marsh, anyone with eyes on the water. Donna said, yes. And then you came with a camera. And the camera could hold what eyes could not hold long enough to be believed. I thought about 14 years of documentary work and the discipline of serving the subject, and I thought about what it means when the subject is not a living person in a room with you, but a missing woman standing at the edges of your frames, with her attention on your camera and her jacket wet, and her direction consistent and her patience across 12 years of being disbelieved, absolute. I thought about what Donna had said the night before. She is still working on it. I looked at the marine survey photographs of the truck on the bottom in 72 feet of water. And I looked at the sonar printouts with their depth contours and their coordinates. And I looked at the chart with its 5 points and its extended line. And I made a decision that 14 years of documentary work had been, I understood in that moment, preparing me to make. I said, I need a boat. Donna said, Pete Arsenault will take you. He has been waiting for someone to ask him to go back to that location since 2014. She paused. He is a man who reports hazards because that is what you do. And he has spent 9 years understanding that the hazard he reported was not adequately addressed. I said, call him. She took out her phone. Outside the boathouse windows, the harbor was fully lit in the September morning, the amber light on the water, and the boats at the fuel dock, and the mud flats receding as the tide came in, the boundary between the exposed and the covered moving with the patient and absolute regularity of something that does not negotiate with the things it covers and uncovers, that simply does what it does on its own schedule. And I sat at the table with the chart and the sonar printouts and 12 years of a mother's organized and strategic grief. And I thought about what is at the end of a line when you follow it all the way to its conclusion. Pete Arsenault was a compact, weathered man in his late 50s who moved around the deck of his lobster boat with the specific, unhurried efficiency of someone who has been doing the same physical work in the same physical environment for long enough that the body has internalized every variable. The deck's pitch, the rope's tension, the exact pressure required to open a bait box in cold weather without losing feeling in your fingers. He had the quality of stillness that working watermen develop. Not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of someone who has learned that unnecessary movement in a boat is wasted energy, and that wasted energy is a thing the sea notices and files away for later. He had said yes to Donna's call in approximately 4 words, which told me that the yes had been prepared for a long time and required no deliberation, only the arrival of the question. We left the fuel dock at 6:15 in the morning, 2 days after Donna had spread her boxes across my table, in the specific pre-dawn gray of coastal Maine at the end of September. The air cold enough to make the breath visible and the water the flat, dark pewter of a harbor before the sun has had any effect on it. Donna was with us, which I had not suggested but had not argued against, because it was her case and her daughter and her 12 years and her right to be present at whatever the boat found at the end of the northeast approach. I had my camera. I always have my camera. This is not a statement of professional dedication, but a statement of the same order as saying I always have my coat in cold weather. The camera being an extension of the way I move through and process the world, rather than a tool I pick up for specific occasions. Pete navigated by memory and by the GPS unit mounted above the wheel, cross-referencing both with the ease of a man who trusts his own knowledge of these waters and uses the technology to confirm rather than to replace that knowledge. We moved through the harbor channel in the early gray. The settlement's lights visible on the shore behind us, the fuel dock, and the general store and Ruth Cray's house at the water's edge, all of it small and specific and receding. And then we were through the channel markers and into the northeast approach, and the water changed its quality immediately. The sheltered harbor surface giving way to the slight rhythmic chop of water that has more room to be itself. I photographed the transition. Pete said nothing for the first 20 minutes of the run. This was not unfriendliness. I had understood within the first few minutes of meeting him that he was a man who spoke when he had something to say, and was not interested in filling silence for its own sake, which is a quality I find restful in the people I work with. Donna sat on the port gunwale and watched the water and also said nothing, and I photographed her watching the water, because a documentary photographer's job is always to photograph the person watching the thing as well as the thing being watched. At the 22-minute mark, Pete slowed the engine. He said, "Here." He had the GPS coordinates from his original snagging incident 9 years ago, entered into his unit, and stored there with the precision of a man who had always intended to come back and had been waiting for the right circumstances to make coming back something other than a solitary and unwitnessed return to a location that no one with any authority had adequately responded to. He cut the engine to a low idle, and we sat on the water in the early morning light, which had by then arrived sufficiently to change the water from pewter to a dark gray-green, the specific color of the Atlantic at depth in September, cold and opaque, and entirely indifferent to what we were doing on its surface. I looked out at the water and thought about 72 feet. 72 feet are not an enormous depth for marine salvage. It is not a recreational diving depth for casual divers, but It is within the range of professional divers, and it is well within the range of remotely operated equipment. It is deep enough that a vehicle on the bottom would not be visible from the surface under any conditions, and would not be locatable without sonar or specific coordinate knowledge. It is deep enough to keep a secret indefinitely if no one with the right equipment and the right question asked the right question at the right location. Pete dropped a buoy marker. He said, "The truck is approximately 30 feet north-northeast of this point." He said it with the directional confidence of a man who had been over this water hundreds of times since the original snagging and had triangulated the position from his gear behavior across multiple subsequent passes. He said, "When my gear snagged in 2014, I assumed it was a mooring block or a lost anchor, something that had been on the bottom for years and had been overlooked on the charts." He paused. I filed the report, and I expected someone to come out and deal with it. He looked at the buoy floating on the gray-green water. "Nobody came," I said. "When did you understand what it was?" he said. "When the marine survey photographs came back and I saw the shape of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been fishing for these waters since I was 14 years old. I know what a mooring block looks like on a sonar screen, and I know what a pickup truck looks like on a sonar screen. They are not similar shapes." He paused. "I filed an amended report with the sheriff's office in 2015 after I had time to think about what the survey photographs were showing." He said, "The amended report was received and logged, and nothing happened." I said, "Who logged it?" He looked at me with the flat, patient expression of a man who has been sitting with an answer for 8 years and is ready to give it. He said, "The duty officer who received the amended report was Dennis Farrow." The water moved under the boat in its rhythmic, unhurried way, the chop coming from the northeast and lifting the hull with the regular patient insistence of a large thing reminding a small thing of the difference in their respective scales. I stood on the deck with my camera, and I looked at the buoy marker. And I thought about Dennis Farrow receiving an amended report about a pickup truck on the bottom of the northeast approach to Cray's Landing Harbor and logging it and doing nothing. 8 years after he had closed the case of a missing woman who had been asking questions about harbor operations. 2 years after he had retired from the sheriff's office, still apparently in sufficient contact with the department's intake process to be the person who received a specific report about a specific location. I thought about the yellow jacket wet. I thought about the fuel dock at 6 in the morning, 4 days after the disappearance date, and a woman standing at the water's edge looking northeast. Donna had been sitting quietly on the gunwale through this exchange. Now she stood up and came to stand beside me at the rail, and we both looked at the buoy and the water around it, and she said, without looking at me, "I have been corresponding with a journalist at the Bangor Daily News for the past 8 months." She paused. I have not given her the sonar printouts or the marine survey photographs or the coordinate information because I knew that without independent corroboration of the line, any story built on my information alone would be characterized as the work of a grieving mother with a fixed idea. She looked at me then. "You are the independent corroboration," I said. "My photographs show a woman who has been dead for 12 years, standing at 5 locations that form a line pointing to the coordinates of a submerged vehicle," she said. "Your photographs show an unidentified figure at 5 locations that form a line pointing to the coordinates of a submerged vehicle that matches the description of the vehicle registered to the investigating officer who closed the case without adequate investigation." She said it precisely, the way she said everything, and I understood that she had rehearsed the information many times, had tested it against every attempt to characterize it as something other than what it was, had made it as resistant to dismissal as she could make it, with the materials available to her. She paused. "My photographs show my daughter. Your photographs show an unidentified figure. The difference matters." She was right. And I knew it, and I sat with the specific discomfort of a documentary photographer who has evidence that is true and evidence that is admissible, and who understands that these two categories are not always the same, and that the gap between them is where 12 years of inadequate investigation had been able to survive. I looked through my viewfinder at the buoy on the water. I pressed the shutter, and in the frame, at the edge of the image, on the water's surface approximately 15 feet from the buoy marker, was a figure in a yellow rain jacket, standing on the water, looking at the camera. I lowered the camera. I looked at the water where the figure had been, and there was nothing there. The gray-green surface moving in its rhythmic chop, the buoy rising and falling, nothing else. I raised the camera and looked through the viewfinder at the same expanse of water. She was still in the frame, standing on the water's surface, with the wet yellow jacket and the dark hair and the sharp features and the quality of attention that I had been photographing for 12 years in the faces of women who needed someone to look carefully enough. And she was not looking northeast this time. She was not pointing. She had finished pointing because the pointing had worked and I was here, and Pete's buoy was in the water above her, and she was looking directly at the camera with an expression I had to lower the camera to steady myself before I could look at again. I raised it again. She was still there, and her expression was not the expression of a ghost or an apparition or anything that required a category outside the ones I already had. It was the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a very long time to be believed, and who is looking at the person who has finally brought the right equipment to the right location and is finally, with sufficient documentation, prepared to believe. I pressed the shutter. I kept pressing it. Donna said, "Mara." I lowered the camera. Donna was looking at me with an expression that asked the question without asking it. I turned the camera and showed her the screen. She looked at the frame for a long time. She did not say anything. She put one hand on the rail of the boat and gripped it, not for balance because the water was not rough, but for the specific reason that a person grips a fixed object when they need something real and solid to hold on to while they feel something enormous. Then she said, very quietly, "She knew you would come." I looked back at the water and the buoy and the gray-green Atlantic moving in its patient and indifferent way above 72 feet of cold water and whatever was resting on the bottom, and I thought about 12 years of a woman standing at the edges of frames and at the edges of harbor docks and at the boundary between the sheltered water and the open water, pointing in the same direction. And I thought about what it costs to wait that long, and how you keep waiting when the people who come to look are not the people who can see. Pete started the engine, he said. "I am going to call the diving service in Rockland when we get back in." He said it the way he said everything, without drama, the statement of a man taking a practical next step. I know the owner. He does commercial recovery work. He can be out here in 48 hours. He turned the boat south toward the harbor. I sat on the port gunwale where Donna had been sitting, and I looked back at the buoy getting smaller on the northeast water, and I kept my camera in my lap, and I did not raise it again, because what needed to be photographed had been photographed, and what needed to be found was going to be found in 48 hours by a commercial dive service out of Rockland. And what needed to happen after that was the thing that Donna Pelletier had been building toward for 12 years with her boxes of documents and her careful strategic patience and her understanding of what kind of evidence would and would not survive contact with the people who had been deciding for 12 years that it was not evidence at all. The harbor entrance came into view ahead of us. The channel markers and the fuel dock and the settlement beyond it in the September morning light, amber and specific and exactly what it was. And I sat with my camera, and I thought about documentary work and about what it means to serve the subject and about how the subject had been serving me, had been leading me, had been placing herself in my frames with the patient and deliberate intelligence of a woman who had understood from the beginning what kind of documentation would be needed, and had waited until the right photographer arrived to provide the frame she needed to be in. The dive service arrived in 41 hours, not 48, which told me that Pete Arsenal's phone call had communicated something beyond the standard parameters of a commercial recovery job, and that the owner of the service had understood, in whatever Pete had said and however Pete had said it, that this was a situation that warranted arriving early rather than on schedule. The owner's name was Frank DeLuca, a broad, deliberate man in his early 60s who ran his operation out of a converted fishing vessel called the Marguerite, and who had, Pete told me on the dock while we waited for the Marguerite to come through the channel, been doing commercial dive work on the Maine coast for 35 years and had recovered things from the bottom of this ocean that he did not discuss, and that had given him a specific and unsentimental relationship with what water keeps and what it eventually gives back. Frank brought 2 divers. Both of them were in their 30s, efficient and quiet, in the way of people who do physical work in dangerous environments and have long since stopped performing competence because actual competence has made the performance unnecessary. They loaded their equipment onto the Marguerite with the organized speed of a crew that has done this many times, and Frank walked the dock to where I was standing, and he looked at me and then at my camera, and he said, "You are the photographer." I said, "Yes." He said, "Pete told me about the photographs." He looked at the harbor for a moment. "I have been doing this work for 35 years, and I have heard things I cannot account for from people I have no reason to disbelieve." He paused. "I am not going to ask you to explain your photographs. I am going to ask you to document what we find today in whatever way you find appropriate, and I am going to ask you not to get in my driver's way while they work." I said, "Understood." He said, "Good." He turned back toward the Marguerite. "We will leave in 20 minutes. Donna was on the dock." She had not asked to come on the Marguerite, and I had not asked Frank to include her, because we had both understood without discussing it that there was a version of this day that ended with something being brought up from 72 feet of water that Donna Pelletier would need to be on shore to receive rather than on a boat to witness. She stood on the dock in the September morning with her hands in her coat pockets, and she watched the Marguerite prepare to leave, and "I will call you the moment there is anything to tell you," she said. "I know." She looked at the boat and then at me. She said, "Whatever is in the truck or not in the truck, it is not Sadie. I want you to know that. I know that." She paused. "Sadie is wherever she has been for 12 years, which is somewhere that my understanding does not reach. The truck is evidence. Evidence is what we need." She said it with the calm of a woman who had separated, over 12 years, the grief from the investigation, understanding that conflating them made both less effective, that the grief needed its own space and the investigation needed its own rigor, and that her job had been to maintain the boundary between the two for long enough to get to a morning like this one. I said, "I will call you." She nodded, and I went aboard the Marguerite. We ran northeast for 23 minutes, and Frank positioned the vessel over Pete's buoy with the efficiency of experienced seamanship, the GPS confirming what his eye and his instruments told him, and the divers suited up with the methodical precision of people performing a sequence they have performed hundreds of times, checking each other's equipment with the mutual attention of professionals who understand that the person checking your gear is the person keeping you alive. I photographed the preparation, the divers entering the water, the surface bubbles that marked their descent, visible for perhaps the first 40 feet before the depth took them below any surface indication of their presence. The Marguerite riding at anchor in the light chop of the northeast approach, the buoy marker off the port side, the coastline of Cray's Landing visible to the southwest in the morning light, the settlement small and specific against the larger mass of the Maine coast. Frank stood at the rail and watched the surface, and said nothing, the specific watching of a man who has sent people into the water many times, and knows that watching the surface is not the same as seeing what is happening below it, but is the only available option, and so he does it with full attention. The divers were down for 19 minutes on the first descent. They came up with photographs taken with the waterproof cameras they carried, and with confirmation of what the sonar had suggested 9 years ago and what Pete had known for 9 years, without being able to make anyone act on his knowing. A 1998 Ford F-150, dark blue, resting on its wheels on the bottom in 71 feet of water, the exterior intact in the way of vehicles that have been in cold salt water for approximately 12 years, the marine growth establishing the timeline with the reliability of an organism that does not adjust its growth rate for human convenience. Frank spread the photographs on the chart table in the Marguerite's small wheelhouse, and I looked at them and photographed them with my camera. And I looked at the truck on the bottom of the northeast approach in the slightly greenish, depth-filtered light of the divers' lamps. And I thought about a dark blue pickup registered to Dennis Farrow, and about a case closed without adequate investigation, and about a woman in a yellow jacket standing at the edges of my frames for 12 days, pointing in this direction. The second descent was longer, 31 minutes. When the divers surfaced the second time, they came up with the thing that changed everything from a submerged vehicle of uncertain provenance into a criminal matter that no county sheriff's office and no retired investigating officer was going to be able to characterize as anything other than what it was. The driver named Ryan, who was the taller of the two and who had said perhaps 20 words since boarding the Marguerite, pulled himself over the gunwale and removed his mask and looked at Frank and said, "There is personal property in the vehicle, in the cab, consistent with long-term submersion, but identifiable." He paused. "There is a wallet. There are keys. There is a phone in a waterproof case that has maintained its integrity." He paused again. "There is a jacket, folded on the rear seat, yellow, rubberized, the heavy kind." Frank looked at me. I looked at Ryan. I said, "The jacket was in the rear seat." "Folded," he said. "Yes, deliberately folded." He said it the way he said everything, without inflection, the delivery of a person reporting exactly what they observed and not 1 degree beyond it. Someone put it there. It did not end up folded by movement or settling or water action. Someone placed it there deliberately. I thought about the evidence log from Sadie's case and Donna's account of the jacket disappearing from it 18 months after the case was closed. I thought about the difference between a jacket disposed of as part of a case closure and a jacket folded carefully on the rear seat of a truck that was then put into 72 feet of cold water on the northeast approach to a Maine harbor. I thought about what it means to keep something. Not to dispose of it, not to destroy it, but to keep it folded in the dark and the cold, in a place that you believed was inaccessible and permanent, where the evidence would be preserved perfectly by the same conditions that were supposed to make it unfindable. I said, "He kept it with the truck. He put it in the truck before he put the truck in the water, and he kept it there for 12 years. Frank said, "That is an interpretation." I said, "Yes." I took out my notebook and wrote down everything Ryan had reported, in the specific and precise language he had used, and I noted the time and the location and the dive depth and the names of everyone present. Then I said, "We need to call the Maine State Police, not the county sheriff's office. The state police." Frank looked at me for a moment. He said, "Already planned on it." He went to the wheelhouse and made the call, and I stood at the rail and looked at the surface of the water above the truck, and I thought about the wallet and the keys and the phone in its waterproof case, and the yellow jacket folded on the rear seat, and I thought about what a phone in a waterproof case that had maintained its integrity for 12 years might contain, and I thought about the specific category of person who puts a phone in a waterproof case before putting it in 72 feet of water, which is the category of person who wants to keep what is on the phone intact and inaccessible simultaneously. And I thought about what Sadie had known about harbor operations and the fuel dock and the arrangements between the harbor master's office and certain boats at irregular hours. I raised my camera. I photographed the surface of the water. She was not in the frame. I looked at the screen, and I looked at the gray-green water, and I waited, and she was not there. And I lowered the camera and stood at the rail in the September light, and I understood, with the specific and documentary clarity of a person who follows evidence to wherever it actually leads, what her absence meant. She had been pointing at this location for 12 years. The pointing was finished. Frank came out of the wheelhouse and said, "The State Police Marine Unit is on the way route from Rockland. Estimated arrival 90 minutes. He paused. They will want to speak with everyone on this vessel, and they will want the photographs. All of them," I said. "They can have everything," he said, "including the ones you took at the harbor." I said, "Including all of them?" He looked at me for a moment, the assessing look of a man who has worked with many people under difficult circumstances and who is taking a reading on whether this particular person is going to hold up through what came next, which was going to be long and procedural and unglamorous, and nothing like the part of the work that photographers are generally known for. He said, "You understand that once you turn over the harbor photographs, what is in them is going to be part of a formal investigation, and you are going to be asked to explain and defend and contextualize what is in them in an environment that is not going to be receptive to certain kinds of explanation." I said, "I know." He said, "The figure in the frames, the woman at the fuel dock and the store and the boat ramp." I said, "An unidentified figure at 5 locations that form a line pointing to the coordinates of a submerged vehicle. That is what the photographs show. That is what I will say." He held my gaze for a moment, then he said, "Good answer. I called Donna from the deck of the Marguerite while we waited for the State Police Marine Unit, and I told her what the divers had found, and I told her about the jacket folded on the rear seat. And I told her that the state police were on the way route, and I listened to her silence on the other end of the line, which was not the silence of a person receiving unexpected information, but the silence of a person receiving the confirmation of something they have known for a very long time and have been carrying alone, and which now, finally, did not have to be carried alone anymore." She said, "The phone." I said, "Yes." She said, "Sadie documented everything she found, everything she noticed, everything she suspected. She kept records the way I keep records." She paused. "If the phone is intact," I said, "the state police will have resources for data recovery that go beyond what the water damage might suggest is possible." She said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "She knew they would find it eventually. She knew that was where to put it." I looked at the water. I said, "She knew someone would come with the right equipment and ask the right question." Donna said, "She waited for the right person." The State Police Marine Unit appeared around the headland to the southwest at the 87-minute mark, moving at speed, its blue lights unnecessary in the daylight but running anyway. And I stood on the deck of the Marguerite and I photographed it coming, and I thought about 12 years and 5 frames and a line pointing northeast and a yellow jacket folded carefully on the rear seat of a dark blue truck in 71 feet of cold water, preserved perfectly by the thing that was supposed to make it invisible, waiting with the absolute patience of evidence that knows it will eventually be found by someone willing to look at the edges of the frame. The state police investigation took 14 months. I want to record that number plainly and without commentary, because the number is its own commentary for anyone who has spent time thinking about what 14 months means in the context of 12 years. What 14 months of active, resourced, professionally conducted investigation represents against 12 years of a mother's organized and strategic patience and a missing woman's 12-year effort to point someone in the right direction from whatever territory she was occupying on the other side of the frame. I stayed in Cray's Landing for 6 weeks after the Marguerite brought the State Police Marine Unit to the coordinates of Pete Arsenal's buoy marker. I stayed because the project required it, and because Donna Pelletier required it, and because the boathouse on the harbor's edge had become, in the way that places become things during the periods of your life that matter most, something that I was not yet ready to leave. The water made its constant sound at night, and the September light became October light and then November light, each transition narrowing and cooling and concentrating, and I photographed all of it, the harbor in the changing season, the settlement conducting its ordinary life around the extraordinary thing that was happening in the water to its northeast, and in the county offices and state police stations that were now in the business of undoing 12 years of a closed case. The phone had yielded its contents. I learned this from the lead investigator, a state police detective named Ann Sylvester, who was precise and careful in the way of someone who had been doing this work long enough to understand that precision and care were not bureaucratic virtues but practical ones, the difference between a case that held in court and a case that did not. She called me at the boathouse on the 3rd week to tell me that the phone's data had been recovered and that its contents were relevant and significant, and that she could not share specifics with me, but wanted me to know that the documentation on the phone had substantially advanced the investigation. I said, "Sadie documented what she found." Ann Sylvester said, "Yes." She paused, a pause of a person deciding how much to confirm. She was thorough. She said it with the specific quality of one careful documenter recognizing the work of another. I thought about Sadie at 26, paying attention to more things at once than most people could track, noticing the fuel dock and the irregular hours and the arrangements that did not correspond to any fishing schedule, building her record the way her mother built records, the instinct for documentation running in the family like a bone structure, and putting the phone in a waterproof case before it went into the water, understanding that the water would keep what you put in it and that eventually someone would come to ask for it back. Dennis Farrow was arrested in the 5th month of the investigation. I was not in Maine when it happened. I was in Boston, where I had returned after 6 weeks in Cray's Landing to process 1,400 photographs and begin the structural work of the project, the editing and sequencing and the decisions about what the project was now, which was different from what I had planned when I drove north in September. I read the arrest report online, sitting at my editing desk in the apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Somerville where I had lived for 7 years, and I read it with the specific and complicated feeling that attends a moment of documentary justice, which is not simple satisfaction and is not triumph, and is something more, like the feeling of a long calculation finally reaching its correct result, the relief of a sequence resolving, mixed with the knowledge of everything that the resolution does not and cannot undo. The charges included obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conduct in office. Additional charges related to the harbor operations that Sadie had been documenting were filed against 3 other individuals, including the former harbor master, in the 9th month of the investigation, after the phone's records had been fully analyzed and cross-referenced with financial and operational records that the state police had subpoenaed from multiple sources. The harbor operation that Sadie had noticed and documented in the summer of 2011 had been running for 6 years before her disappearance and had continued, with modifications and personnel changes, for 4 years after it, until the investigation's expanding scope had encompassed it. I am not going to describe the harbor operation in detail here, because the detail belongs to the court record and the investigative reporting that Anne Sylvester and the journalist from the Bangor Daily News, the one Donna had been corresponding with for 8 months before my arrival, produced in collaboration over the 14 months of the investigation, and because the detail is available to anyone who wants it, and because this account is not about the harbor operation but about Sadie Pelletier and what she did with the 12 years she had available to her after she went into the water. I want to record what she did. She appeared in the frames of a documentary photographer who came to Cray's Landing in September to ask the questions that had not been asked, and she placed herself at 5 specific locations that formed a line pointing to the evidence that would break the case, and she maintained that consistency across 12 days of my presence there, with the patience and the precision of someone who had been practicing the approach for 12 years, refining it through Carl Bouchard's sighting and Helen Marsh's sighting and whoever else had eyes on the water in that harbor across 12 years and had seen something they could not fully account for and had reported it and been told their credibility was limited. She had been practicing, learning what worked and what did not, learning that living witnesses were insufficient because living witnesses could be characterized, and that a camera might be different, might hold what eyes could not hold long enough to survive contact with the people who needed it not to survive. She had been right. I want to record something else which is harder to record, and which I have been circling for the duration of this account in the way that I circle the things that matter most, approaching them from the outside and moving inward, because the outside is where the documentable facts are and the inside is where the thing that cannot be documented lives, and the inside is not where a documentary photographer is supposed to spend much time. I went back to the frames in December, 4 months after I had left Cray's Landing, sitting at my editing desk in the Somerville apartment, with the investigation ongoing and the project taking its new shape around me, and I ran the full sequence of harbor and settlement photographs one more time from the beginning. She was in 23 frames, not 5. 23. I had found 5 in the first week. The other 18 had been in the sequence the entire time, in frames I had culled as keepers for their primary subjects, their compositions, their light, and in which she was present at the edges with the same quality of attention and the same deliberate stillness, in positions I now recognized as forming not just the single northeast line I had plotted on the harbor chart, but a more complex pattern, a series of overlapping lines that triangulated not just the location of the truck, but 3 other specific locations in and around Cray's Landing that the investigation subsequently identified as relevant to the harbor operation. She had not been pointing at one thing. She had been pointing at everything she knew. I had only plotted 5 points because 5 were all I had found in the first week, and I had moved to action on the basis of 5 because 5 were sufficient, and she had known 5 were sufficient for the most urgent thing, the truck, the jacket, the phone, and she had continued to populate my frames with the additional information while I was acting on the first set. Because she was working on the investigation from her side of it, the way Donna was working on it from her side, the way I was working on it from mine, the way Pete Arsenault had been working on it since 2014 by storing coordinates and waiting and filing amended reports that disappeared into the inbox of the person they were filed against. Multiple people on multiple sides of whatever boundary divides the available from the unavailable. working the same case. I called Donna when I found the additional 18 frames. She listened while I described them and the positions they documented, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, she never stopped. She said it with the wonder of a person understanding something about someone they loved that they had not fully understood before. Even after she was, wherever she was, she just kept working. I said, she knew what she had and she knew what it would take to surface it, and she was patient. Donna said she was always patient. She paused. I was not patient. She paused again. She got that from her father, the patience. I got too angry too fast, and it cost me credibility. She was angry too, but she knew how to hold it behind the work. She stopped. I taught her to document, but she taught herself to be patient about it. I sat at my editing desk in December with the 23 frames open on my screen, and I looked at the figure at the edges of them, dark-haired and sharp-featured and paying attention to more than one thing at once, and I thought about the specific and enormous effort of presence required to populate 23 frames across 12 days, in conditions that I did not have a framework for understanding. And I thought about what it costs to do that kind of work when the normal resources for the doing of work are not available to you. I thought about what she had spent. I thought about the last frame she was in, which was the one I had taken from the deck of the Marguerite over the buoy marker, standing on the water's surface in the wet yellow jacket with her attention on my camera and the expression of a woman who has been waiting to be believed and is looking at the person who has finally arrived with sufficient documentation and sufficient willingness to look at the edges of the frame. And I thought about her absence from every frame I had taken after that moment. The work was done. She had finished. And I thought about what finishing meant, and about what it allows, and about the specific quality of rest that is available to a thing that has been working without rest for a very long time, and has finally been able to stop. The project opened in April at a gallery in Portland, Maine, which felt correct in every way. The geography and the season and the specific quality of April light in New England, which is the light of a thing that has been waiting through a long winter and is finally being allowed to begin. The exhibition was called Every Frame She Left. It contained 64 photographs, including all 23 frames in which Sadie appeared, printed large and placed in sequence along the gallery's longest wall so that the viewer moved through them the way the investigation had moved through them, discovering the figure at the edges gradually, understanding the pattern incrementally, arriving at the Marguerite frame at the end of the wall where she was standing on the water in the wet yellow jacket with her full attention on the camera. Donna came to the opening. She stood in front of the Marguerite frame for a long time, longer than she stood in front of any other image, and I stood at a sufficient distance to give her the space the moment required. And I watched her face the way a documentary photographer watches a face when the thing the face is feeling is the thing the entire project has been moving toward, the culmination that justifies every preceding frame. Then she turned and found me across the gallery, and she looked at me with an expression that I am not going to attempt to describe in the language of documentation, because it was not a thing that documentation can hold. And she said, across the distance between us, quietly enough that I read it more than heard it. "Thank you for looking," I said. She made it easy to look. Donna said she always did. She said it with the specific smile of a mother describing a quality of a child she knew deeply, the smile of someone's accessing a memory that is entirely and specifically theirs. And she turned back to the frame, to her daughter on the water in the September light. And she looked at her for as long as she needed to look. I went home to Somerville after the opening, and I sat at my editing desk, and I opened the project file one more time, and I ran the sequence from the beginning, the harbor photographs and the fuel dock and the general store, and the boat ramp and the boathouse window, all 64 frames in their finished sequence. And at the end of the sequence, I sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment. Then I opened a new folder. I had another project waiting, another woman, another closed case, another community that had been told to stop looking. I had been corresponding with the family for 2 months, and I was due to drive north in May, toward a different part of the Maine coast, a different harbor, a different set of questions that had not been adequately asked. I looked at the empty folder. I thought about what I had learned in Cray's Landing, which was not only what I had known before about documentary work and the discipline of serving the subject, but something additional and specific that I was going to carry into every project from this point forward. The subject does not wait for you to find her. If the work is important enough, and the photographer is the right photographer, and the patience on the subject's side has not been exhausted by 12 years of being overlooked and disbelieved, the subject finds you first. My job is to be the kind of photographer who looks at the edges of the frame. I drive north in May. I always bring my camera. The drive north in May took 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than the September drive because I stopped once at a gas station outside Brunswick where I had stopped on the September drive as well, and I sat in the parking lot for longer than filling the tank required because I was thinking about something that had been sitting at the edge of my attention for the 4 months since the gallery opening, the way things sit at the edge of the frame when they are not yet ready to be looked at directly. I want to record what I had been thinking about, because this account has been built on the discipline of recording the things that are difficult to record as precisely as the things that are straightforward, and this particular thing is both important and difficult. I had been thinking about the other 18 frames. Not what was in them, which I knew precisely, and had documented, and had turned over to the investigation, and which had contributed to the charges filed in the 9th month against the former harbor master, and the 3 other individuals whose connection to the harbor operation, Sadie, had spent the last summer of her accessible life documenting on a phone she put in a waterproof case because she understood, on some level, that the documentation was more important than the documenter and needed to survive in conditions that the documenter might not. What I had been thinking about was the fact that I had missed them. 14 years of documentary work, 14 years of the discipline of looking at the edges of the frame, of not allowing the primary subject to consume all the available attention, of maintaining the peripheral awareness that distinguishes documentary photography from portraiture, of seeing rather than merely recording, which is the distinction my professor had identified 38 years old and 14 years, too late for the critique to still sting, but not too late for it to still matter. I had found 5 and missed 18. I had found enough to act on, and I had acted on it, and the action had been correct and the investigation had followed, and the outcome had been, in the 14 months of its unfolding, as complete as these things ever are, which is to say substantially but not entirely, because outcomes in missing persons cases are never entire, because what is missing stays missing even when what happened to it has been found and accounted for and brought into the light of legal process and court record and investigative journalism. But I had missed 18 frames, and in the gap between what I found and what was there, I kept locating the shape of my own limitation, the specific dimensions of what my trained and practiced attention had failed to hold, and it was uncomfortable in the particular way that limitations are uncomfortable when they are limitations of craft rather than of circumstance, when they are things that more careful looking would have addressed. I had looked carefully. I had looked more carefully than most people look, and I had still missed 18 out of 23. I thought about this in the gas station parking lot outside Brunswick. and then I got back on the road and drove north. The new project was in a harbor settlement called Millhaven, 40 minutes northeast of Cray's Landing. A community of similar scale and similar character, another working harbor with its lobster boats and its fuel dock and its general store. Another September disappearance. Another case that had been closed with findings that did not satisfy the available evidence, and a family that had been told to stop looking and had not stopped. The woman's name was Clara Devereaux. She had been 31 years old in September of 2016, 7 years before my arrival, and she had been a marine biologist working on water quality assessments in the coastal zone, which meant she had been on the water and in the water, and had been paying attention to the water in ways that most people in harbor communities were not. And she had, in the months before her disappearance, filed 3 formal reports with the State Department of Environmental Protection about discharge readings she had taken in the channel northeast of Millhaven Harbor that significantly exceeded permitted levels. The reports had been received and logged and investigated by an inspector who had found no evidence of prohibited discharge and had closed each report within 30 days of filing. The inspector's name was not in the public record of the reports, which was irregular because inspection records were public documents and inspector identification was a standard component of the public record. I had been corresponding with Clara's sister, a woman named Beth Devereaux, for 3 months, and I had been doing the same preparation I always did, the research and the document review, and the correspondence that established the relationship of trust on which the project would depend. And I had been doing one additional thing that I had not done before any previous project. I had been looking at the edges. Not of photographs, not yet, because I had not yet been to Millhaven and I had no photographs from Millhaven. I had been looking at the edges of the documents, the places in the correspondence and the reports and the case file that Beth had shared with me, where the language went careful in the specific way that language goes careful when a document has been written with awareness, that certain things should not be directly stated, the bureaucratic equivalent of the 40-degree turn away from full face, the angle that shows you the jaw and the cheekbone and the line of the brow and not quite the eyes. I had found 3 such places in the documents. They formed a line. I did not know yet where the line pointed. I would find that out in Millhaven, with my camera, in whatever time it took, looking at the edges of every frame, with the specific and newly calibrated attention of a photographer who had spent the previous 8 months understanding the dimensions of what careful looking had missed. The settlement came into view at 4 in the afternoon, which was the same time of day I had arrived in Cray's Landing in September. The amber light of a late afternoon in early May, warmer and longer than September's amber, but with the same quality of the day considering how to end itself, the light preparing to transition into something else, and doing it with the gradual, specific beauty of a coastal Maine afternoon that knows exactly what it is doing. The contact was Beth Devereaux, who met me at the harbor rather than at a house, which I noted as a choice rather than a convenience, because Beth had known I was arriving at 4, and the harbor was not on the direct route from the county road, and choosing the harbor as the meeting point was a statement about where the story was centered and where she wanted me to begin my attention. She was 44 years old, with the lean physicality of someone who spent time outdoors, and she had the directness that I was beginning to understand was a coastal Maine characteristic, the quality of people who live close to something large and indifferent and have organized their relationship with directness accordingly. She shook my hand and she looked at my camera and she said, "I was told about what you found in Cray's Landing." She said it without preamble. Donna Pelletier called me in February. She told me what happened with the photographs. I said, "What did she tell you?" she said. "That the photographs found things that the eye could not hold long enough. She looked at the harbor, at the water in the afternoon light. She told me to let you work. She told me not to tell you anything beyond what the documents contain, because the documents are what you need and the photographs are what you need, and anything I add to that is going to shape what you find in a direction that comes from me rather than from Clara," I said. She understood the methodology. She said you told her that the subject finds you if you are the right photographer. She looked at me. She said to tell you that Clara has been waiting. I looked at the harbor. The water was the specific blue-green of a Maine harbor in early May, cold and clear in the shallows near the dock, and deepening to opacity further out the channel northeast of the harbor entrance, visible as a slightly darker ribbon of water where the depth increased. And I looked at the channel, and I thought about water quality reports and discharge readings and an inspector whose name was not in the public record, and a woman who had been paying attention to the water in ways that most people in harbor communities were not. I raised my camera. I looked through the viewfinder at the harbor in the afternoon light, the fuel dock and the moored boats, and the channel beyond them, and the open water beyond that, the whole of it arranged in the May light with the patient and specific reality of a place that has been exactly what it is for a very long time. At the edge of the frame, at the end of the fuel dock where the planking stopped and the water began, was a figure, a woman, standing very still, with the quality of having stopped there rather than passing through, the posture of a person who is looking at something rather than moving toward or away from it. Her attention was directed toward the camera, toward me. She was wearing a bright orange safety vest of the kind that field researchers wear when they are working on or near the water, the high visibility kind that is designed to be seen from a distance, and the vest was wet. I had arrived 4 hours ago. I had not yet taken a single frame. She was already in the viewfinder. I pressed the shutter, and I thought about Cray's landing, and the 23 frames, and the 18 I had missed, and the 5 I had found, and I thought about Sadie Pelletier standing on the water in the wet yellow jacket, with her full attention on my camera, the expression of a woman who has been waiting to be believed, and is looking at the person who has finally arrived with sufficient documentation and sufficient willingness to look. And I thought about what I had learned about the edges of the frame and about the patience that exists on the other side of the frame, the enormous and costly patience of the work that continues in the territories that my understanding does not reach. I lowered the camera and looked at the screen. She was there. At the edge of the frame, at the end of the dock, the orange vest bright in the May afternoon light, the water visible beyond her, the channel beyond that, the open ocean beyond that, and somewhere out there in the water northeast of this harbor, something that had been put somewhere it was not supposed to be, waiting with the patience of evidence for the right person to arrive with the right question and the right equipment and the right willingness to follow a line all the way to its end. I looked up from the screen. Beth was watching me, I said. She is here. Beth closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were steady and direct and entirely present, the eyes of a person receiving information they have been waiting for and are ready to act on, she said. Where? I showed her the screen. She looked at the frame for a long time. She looked at the figure at the end of the dock, at the orange vest, at the stillness of the posture, at the direction of the attention. She said, "That is her vest. The field vest, the one she wore for water sampling." She paused. It was never recovered. It was not in the evidence log. She paused again. It was never in the evidence log. I looked at the harbor and the channel and the open water beyond, and I thought about the inspector whose name was not in the public record, and about discharge readings that exceeded permitted levels, and about a woman who had been paying attention to the water in ways that most people were not, and who had been waiting 7 years in the orange vest for a photographer to arrive and raise a camera at the right moment and look at the edge of the frame with sufficient attention to see her standing there. I took out my notebook. I began to document. This is what I do. I arrive in a place where something happened that was not adequately seen, and I look at what the camera holds when the eye cannot hold it long enough, and I follow the line from the edge of the frame to wherever it leads, through the harbor and the channel and the open water to whatever is waiting on the bottom, patient in the cold and the dark, preserved by the thing that was supposed to make it invisible, keeping itself available for the person willing to look at the edges long enough to find it. I have not yet counted the frames. I will count them tonight, in whatever accommodation Beth has arranged, with the harbor making its low and constant sound outside the window, and the May light finally gone, and the water dark, and the channel marker lights visible from any window that faces northeast. And I will plot the points, and the points will form a line, and I will follow the line, because that is the work, and the work does not stop when one project closes and another opens, because the women do not stop waiting when one photographer leaves and another arrives, and because somewhere out there in the cold water of the Maine coast that there are things that were put in places they were not supposed to be by people who believed the water would keep their secrets permanently. The water keeps everything, but it gives back what it holds when the right person asks in the right language, and I have spent 14 years learning that language, and I have been learning it more fluently since September, since Cray's landing, since a woman in a yellow jacket stood at the end of a fuel dock in the early morning and placed herself in the background of my frame and trusted me to look carefully enough to find her. I am looking, I am always looking, at the edges where the true things wait. Story 2, The Color of the Milk. There is a specific kind of fear that has no name in English, though the Japanese came close with their concept of bukimi, the uncanny, the wrongly familiar, the thing that wears the face of the ordinary and cannot quite hold the expression. It is not the fear of the monster. It is the fear of the moment just before you understand that the thing standing in front of you, which looks entirely like a person, which is smiling the way a person smiles and saying the things a person would say, is not. This story is about that moment, except the moment does not end. I want you to think about something before we begin. Think about the last time you poured yourself a glass of milk, or made a cup of tea, or sat at a table in a familiar room and looked around at everything you knew, and felt for just one terrible second that none of it was right. That is the door where this story opens. Let us see what is on the other side. The drive from Prince George to Whistler Creek takes approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes under normal conditions, which in northern British Columbia in October means conditions that are already beginning to negotiate with the concept of normal in ways that southern drivers do not fully appreciate until they are already committed. The way the cloud cover drops without warning and transforms a clear afternoon into a premature gray dusk. The way the highway narrows between tree lines that have been growing for 100 years and have developed, over that century, an opinion about roads and the people who travel them. Nora Ellison had driven it before. She had driven it twice in the previous year. Once in June, when the light lasted until nearly 10 in the evening, and the mountains were still carrying snow on their upper faces, and the drive had felt in the way that certain drives feel when the weather is right and you have the window slightly open and the right music, like something close to joy. And once in February on a road she will not think about again if she can avoid it, in conditions that she had been warned about and had decided, for reasons that seemed reasonable at the time and unreasonable in retrospect, to proceed through anyway. That drive had ended with her car on a pull-off at kilometer 207, with the engine running for warmth and her phone showing 1 bar of signal and the snow coming down in the particular sideways, relentless way that northern snow comes down when it has made a decision. And she had sat in the car for 3 hours until the road cleared enough for a salt truck to pass, and she had followed it at a respectful distance to the next town, and checked into a motel, and eaten a meal at a diner, and driven the rest of the way in the morning. October was not February. October was manageable. If you left early enough and drove sensibly and did not stop anywhere that was not a scheduled fuel stop. She left Prince George at 7:43 in the morning, which was later than she had planned, but earlier than she had feared, because the morning had the particular quality of mornings that require a great deal of administration before they will release you. Coffee to be made, bag to be packed and repacked, the apartment to be closed up in the specific sequence of tasks that she had developed over 3 years of living alone, and that she could not deviate from without a low-level anxiety that would accompany her for the rest of the day like a sound she could almost but not quite hear. Her name was Nora Ellison, and she was 37 years old, and she worked as a contracts administrator for a forestry company, whose head office was in Whistler Creek, a town of 6,000 people that she had moved to from Vancouver 4 years ago, for reasons that had seemed, at the time, entirely to do with the job offer and the salary and the pace of life, and that she understood now had also been to do with wanting to put a significant physical distance between herself and a version of her life that she was finished with. She had put the distance. The version of her life she was finished with had stayed in Vancouver as requested. The job was good, and the town was manageable, and she had found, in the 4 years since the move, that the particular quality of solitude available in a northern town, the solitude of a place where the land is larger than the people in it, where the weather is a genuine and constant participant in daily life rather than a background condition, where you can drive 20 minutes in any direction and be entirely alone with nothing but spruce and sky, suited something in her that the density of Vancouver had never quite accommodated. She drove south on Highway 16, with the morning clouds still low and the tree line dark on both sides, and she listened to a podcast about the history of cartography, which was the kind of podcast she chose when she wanted her mind to be occupied without being demanded of, when she wanted the intellectual equivalent of background music, present, textured, not requiring response. At 9:14, she passed through Vanderhoof, which was where she always stopped for fuel, because the next reliable station was another 110 kilometers south, and she filled the tank and bought a coffee and a blueberry muffin from the young woman behind the counter who had, Nora estimated, been working the morning shift at this particular gas station long enough to have developed the specific practiced quality of someone who has learned to perform cheerfulness with the same automated fluency that they perform the other tasks of the job, the coffee pour, the receipt print, the have a good drive north or south or wherever you are going. She drove south from Vanderhoof. The podcast continued its history of cartography, which had arrived at the 16th century, and the particular problem of mapping coastlines that nobody had yet sailed, the way cartographers of that era had dealt with the edges of the known world, sometimes by simply leaving them blank, sometimes by filling them with sea monsters and warning text, and sometimes by doing the thing that Nora found most interesting and most honest, which was drawing the coastline as though it were complete and familiar, as though someone had been there and returned with measurements, when in fact the line was pure conjecture, a confident assertion about the shape of a world the cartographer had never seen. She thought about this. She thought about the way certainty and knowledge are not the same thing, and how confidently they can be made to resemble each other, and how the map that looks complete is sometimes the most dangerous one. At 10:41, she passed the sign for Aldermore. She had not planned to stop at Aldermore. She had passed through Aldermore before, on the June Drive, and had noted it as a small community. The kind of community that exists on BC secondary highways at intervals of roughly 40 to 60 kilometers, built originally around a single industry and then sustained afterward by the services that a community of that size generates for itself. A gas station, a diner or a general store, a school if the population supports it, a community hall, the particular compact economy of a place that has decided to persist against the logic of geography and the indifference of distance. She had not stopped in June because she had not needed to. She stopped now because, without any prior intention of doing so, she found her foot moving from the accelerator to the brake, found herself turning onto the two-lane road that led from the highway into Aldermore's Main Street, found herself pulling into the gravel lot beside what appeared to be a diner and switching off the engine and sitting for a moment in the specific, slightly surprised stillness of someone who has done something without making a decision to do it. She was mildly hungry. The muffin had been some time ago. This was a sufficient explanation, and she accepted it, and she got out of the car. The morning had changed while she was driving. The cloud was higher now, and the light had the quality of northern October light when it decides to make an effort. Not warm, not thin, but a kind of flat, clear, pewter brightness that illuminated everything with perfect and shadowless evenness, the way light in a photograph illuminates things, the way things look when the conditions are precisely right for visibility, and somehow, despite that precision, manage to look slightly less real for it. She stood in the gravel lot and looked at the main street of Aldermore. There was the diner, whose sign read Aldermore Family Restaurant in green letters on a whiteboard, the kind of sign produced by a local sign shop in a style that had been current in the 1980s and had not been updated since, which was unremarkable. There was a hardware store. There was a building whose function she could not immediately determine, with a plate glass window and a closed sign, and a display in the window that appeared to consist of several items that did not obviously belong together. A set of kitchen scales, a folded map, 3 tins of paint in different shades of the same color. There were 2 vehicles parked on the main street, both trucks, both white, both of a model and age that was consistent with working vehicles in a community of this kind. There was a woman walking on the far side of the street, moving away from Nora at a pace that suggested purposefulness, bundled in a dark coat, her face not visible. Everything was correct. Everything was precisely and entirely correct. Nora stood in the gravel lot with the flat pewter light pressing down from above and looked at the main street of Aldermore and felt, arriving in her chest without announcement, without visible cause, without a single concrete thing she could have pointed to as its origin, a feeling that she had no adequate word for. The closest word she had was wrong. Not wrong in the way that a misread sign is wrong, or the wrong turn is wrong, or the wrong key selected from a ring is wrong. Wrong in the way that her own name looked wrong if she stared at it long enough. Wrong in the way that the world looks wrong in the 1 or 2 seconds after a very deep sleep, before the brain has fully returned to the consensus of reality and is still holding the private reality of the dream alongside it, and has not yet decided which one to commit to. She stood in the gravel lot and breathed the cold October air, which smelled of spruce and diesel, and, beneath both of those, something else, something she could not identify, something mineral and faint and entirely still, the way the air smells in a room where the windows have been closed for a very long time. She looked at the woman walking on the far side of the street, who was now almost at the end of the block, and who moved correctly and wore her coat correctly, and was entirely ordinary in every aspect that Nora could observe, and who had not, in the time that Nora had been standing in this lot looking at her, turned her head. Not once. Not to glance at the car that had pulled off the highway. Not to register the presence of a stranger in a small town where strangers were, by the arithmetic of small towns, noticeable. Not once. Nora told herself that this meant nothing. She went into the diner. The diner was warm. This was the first thing. The warmth that came against her face when she pushed the glass door open, the warmth of a space that had been heated continuously for many hours, that had accumulated the warmth of cooking and coffee and bodies, in the particular layered way that small diners accumulate it, so that stepping inside felt less like entering a room and more like entering a condition, a sustained and deliberate state of being warm that the space had been maintaining long before she arrived, and would continue maintaining long after she left. She stood just inside the door for a moment and let her eyes adjust. The diner had 8 tables. She counted them automatically the way she counted things when she needed to establish the dimensions of an unfamiliar space. 8 tables, 4 booths along the window side, 4 freestanding tables in the center, all of them covered in the same red and white checked oilcloth that diners of this vintage and disposition considered a foundational design decision rather than a choice. There were 4 other people inside. A man at the counter, on the 3rd stool from the left, with a mug of coffee in front of him and his hands wrapped around it, and his eyes on the middle distance above the serving hatch, in the way that people look when they are not looking at anything in particular, when looking is simply what the eyes are doing while the rest of the person is occupied elsewhere. 2 women in the far booth seated across from each other, with plates in front of them, and what appeared to be a conversation in progress, though Nora, standing at the door, could not hear what they were saying, and a teenage boy at the table nearest the window, with a glass of orange juice in front of him and a book open beside the glass, reading in the slightly performative way that teenagers read in public places, with the awareness of being seen reading as a component of the reading itself. All of this was ordinary. All of this was the precise contents of a diner in a small town on a northern British Columbia highway on a Tuesday morning in October, assembled with the fidelity of something that had studied what a diner in a small town on a northern British Columbia highway looks like, and had reproduced the details with complete accuracy. Nora walked to a booth. She chose the second one from the door, which gave her a clear sightline to the window and the gravel lot where her car was parked and the main street beyond it, and she sat down and placed her hands flat on the oilcloth and looked at the laminated menu that was already on the table, wedged between the napkin dispenser and a ceramic condiment caddy holding salt, pepper, ketchup, and a small jar of what the handwritten label identified as house mustard. The menu was exactly what she expected. Eggs in 4 preparations, pancakes, toast, a section labeled lunch items that included 2 sandwiches, a soup of the day, and a burger, coffee, tea, juice, pie with a handwritten insert that said today's pie was Saskatoon berry, which was the kind of detail that small diners in this part of British Columbia included on their menus with the quiet regional confidence of a community that knows what grows here and considers it sufficient. She looked at the menu for a longer time than the menu required. She understood, using the menu the way she sometimes used her notebook, as an object to look at while the rest of her was doing something else, while the rest of her was very quietly and very carefully attending to the room behind the menu, running its inventory of details against some internal standard she had not consciously established and could not have articulated. A woman appeared at the table, She was perhaps 50, with short gray hair and a practical quality to her face, the kind of face that has been doing a specific job for a long time and has organized itself around the requirements of that job. The readiness, the slightly forward posture, the pen already in hand. She said, "Good morning, what can I get you?" Her voice was entirely ordinary. It had the flattened, regional quality of northern BC speech. The slight shortening of vowels, the declarative rather than interrogative intonation on what would, in other mouths, be a question. Nora said, "Coffee, please, and eggs scrambled with toast." The woman wrote this down. She said, "Brown or white?" Nora said, "Brown, please." The woman wrote this down and took the menu and went back toward the serving hatch without further conversation, which was the correct amount of conversation for this interaction in this kind of place, and which Nora noted and approved of in the part of her mind that was conducting the inventory. She looked out the window. The main street of Aldermore was still there, in the flat pewter light, entirely as she had left it. The two white trucks were still parked where they had been. The woman in the dark coat was gone, which was correct. She had been walking purposefully. She had had somewhere to be. She had arrived there. Nothing moved on the street. Nothing at all. Nora watched the street for what she estimated was 3 full minutes. And in those 3 minutes, the street did not move. Not a curtain, not a door, not a bird crossing the frame of her window, not a vehicle on the highway beyond the junction that should, at this hour on a Tuesday morning, have been producing the occasional truck or passenger car in either direction. Nothing. The street lay in its pewter light and held completely still. She became aware that the two women in the far booth had stopped talking. She did not look at them directly. She kept her eyes on the window and was aware, in the peripheral way that the body registers things before the mind has decided to register them, that the booth at the far end of the diner had gone quiet in a way that was not the natural pause of a conversation between two people who know each other well, where silences have texture and familiarity and do not require filling. This was a different quality of quiet, the quality of quiet that occurs when two people have stopped talking because something has changed in the room, because there is a new variable that requires their attention, because they are both, without looking at the same thing. Her coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around the mug the way the man at the counter had wrapped both hands around his mug, and she looked at the coffee, and she noted, in the entirely calm and methodical way she was noting everything, that the coffee was the correct color, the correct temperature, the correct weight of ceramic under her hands. She told herself, being irrational. She was in a diner in a small town on a highway she had driven before, and she had not slept particularly well, and she had been driving for over 3 hours, and the October light in northern BC did things to the quality of the visible world that were disconcerting if you were not accustomed to them, and all of this was sufficient explanation for the low, sourceless feeling of wrong that had settled across her shoulders like a coat she had not chosen to put on. She drank the coffee. It tasted of coffee. She looked at the man at the counter, allowing herself to look at him directly for the first time since she had entered. He was perhaps 60, with a working man's posture, the forward roll of the shoulders, the heaviness in the hands, the quality of someone who has spent decades doing physical labor and whose body has organized itself permanently around that requirement. He wore a canvas jacket, dark green, with a small tear in the left shoulder seam that had been there long enough for the tear to have gathered a faint border of grime. His coffee mug was white, institutional, the same as hers. He had not moved since she came in, not meaningfully, not in any way that was impossible. He had lifted the mug twice. She had seen this in her peripheral field, and he had set it down. But his eyes were still on the same middle distance above the serving hatch, with the same quality of attention she had noticed when she first came in, and his shoulders had not shifted. and his back was at the same angle, and he had not, in the time she had been watching him, done any of the small, unconscious things that people do when they are sitting quietly in a public place. He had not shifted his weight, had not scratched an itch, had not exhaled audibly, had not looked toward the sound of her coffee being placed on the table. He was very still. People were sometimes very still. Nora was sometimes very still. She moved her eyes to the teenage boy at the window table. He was still reading. She could see the pages of the book from here, the small, close columns of text, and his eyes were moving across them in the rhythm of someone engaged with what they were reading, tracking left to right and then dropping to the next line in the smooth, practiced way of a reader who does not sound out the words, who has long since made reading a transparent process rather than a mechanical one. His eyes were moving, but the page had not turned. She had been in the diner for 8 minutes by the clock above the serving hatch, and the page had not turned. She watched for another 2 minutes. The eyes moved. The page did not turn. She looked at the clock above the serving hatch. It was correct. The minute hand moved in its correct interval, its second-by-second advance across the face, and she watched it complete a full minute, and then another, and the time it showed was consistent with the time on her phone, and there was nothing wrong with the clock. She looked at her phone. She looked at it not because she needed to, but because she needed the phone to look at. She needed something in her hands that was entirely and verifiably hers, that had come from Prince George with her, that had no connection to this room and these people. That was a fixed point she could locate herself in relation to. She had 4 bars of signal. She opened her messages and looked at a thread from her colleague James, who had texted her the previous evening about the contracts file she was bringing back from Prince George, a straightforward work exchange that she read 3 times and found, each time, to contain exactly the words it had always contained, to be exactly as tedious and legible as it had always been, to be entirely real. She put the phone down. Her eggs arrived. The waitress set them in front of her with the toast on a separate plate and a small ramekin of butter and said, "Anything else for now?" And Nora said no thank you. And the waitress went back to the kitchen, and Nora looked at the eggs. They were scrambled eggs. They were the correct color and the correct texture, and they smelled precisely as scrambled eggs smell when they are freshly made. That specific warm, sulfurously, faintly sweet smell that is one of the most reliably comforting smells in the catalog of breakfast smells, that belongs entirely to the category of ordinary things, that has no business making her feel what she felt looking at it, which was nothing, which was the problem. She looked at the eggs, and she felt nothing that she expected to feel, no appetite, no simple bodily pleasure in the proximity of food after 3 hours of driving, no comfort. She felt instead the feeling she had been feeling, Scribblot now clarified. Not fear, not danger. Something more specific and more disorienting than either of those things. The feeling of a person who has looked at a word they have written every day of their adult life and found that it does not look like a word, that the letters are correctly assembled and the spelling is correct and the word is the word she always knew it to be, and it has ceased, entirely and without explanation, to mean anything. She looked at the eggs, and they were eggs and they did not mean eggs. She picked up her fork. She ate 4 bites, which required the kind of deliberate physical effort that eating requires when the body has decided that the matter of food is secondary to some other more pressing matter it has not yet communicated clearly to the conscious mind. She looked at the 2 women in the far booth. They were talking again, or they appeared to be talking. Their mouths were moving. Their faces were arranged in the expressions of people engaged in conversation. One of them was nodding in the way people nod when they are following what someone else is saying, when they are tracking the argument and agreeing with its direction. But Nora, who was not far from them, who was sitting in a room of 8 tables with a ceiling of ordinary height and no particular acoustic complexity, could not hear them. She could hear the clock. She could hear the faint mechanical sound of something operating in the kitchen beyond the serving hatch. She could hear her own fork against the plate. She could not hear the 2 women talking. She set her fork down. She looked at the man at the counter. He had turned while she was watching the women and was now facing her, not looking at her, facing her in the way a face can be oriented toward a thing while the eyes are pointed somewhere that is not the thing, that is the space adjacent to the thing, that is the place just to the left of where she was sitting, so that the orientation of his body said, "I am looking at you," and the orientation of his eyes said, "I am not looking at anything." She held very still. She sat in the second booth from the door in the Aldermore family restaurant and held very still and breathed and looked at the man who was facing her without looking at her, and she thought, with the precise and careful clarity of a person who has decided to be honest with herself about something she would very much prefer not to be honest about, that she was going to pay for her breakfast and get back in her car. She was going to do this now. She reached into her jacket pocket for her wallet, and the teenage boy at the window table beside her turned the page. She looked at him. He was reading. His eyes were moving across the new page, left to right, tracking, smooth, practiced. She looked at the page he had turned from, which was now the verso, the left-hand page, and she could see the columns of text from here, and the columns of text were blank, white. The page he had been reading for the 10 or 11 minutes she had been watching him. The page whose text she had seen from here clearly enough to confirm that it was text, columns of small close print, was white, empty. She looked at his face. He was reading. She put $32 on the table, which was more than the meal would cost, but which meant she did not need to wait for the check, which meant she could stand up now and walk to the door and push it open and cross the gravel lot to her car in the same unhurried way she had walked in. Because the thing she understood with the part of her that had been running the quiet inventory since the moment she had stood in the gravel lot and felt the wrongness come into her chest without cause was that she needed to move toward the door at exactly the speed of a person who has finished her breakfast and is continuing her drive south and has no particular feeling about Aldermore one way or the other. She stood. She put on her jacket. She walked to the door. She did not look at the man at the counter. She did not look at the 2 women in the booth. She pushed the glass door open, and the cold October air came against her face, and she crossed the gravel lot and got in her car and put the key in and started the engine and checked her mirrors and reversed out of the lot and turned back onto the 2-lane road toward the highway. She did not look in the rearview mirror at the diner until she was at the junction with the highway. When she looked, the diner was there, with its green and white sign and its window and its flat pewter light on the glass, entirely ordinary, entirely still. No one had come to the door. No one was watching her go. She pulled onto the highway and drove south, and she kept both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and she did not think about the page. She thought about the page. She drove for 11 minutes before she stopped thinking about the page. This was not because she resolved it. She did not resolve it. She had no mechanism for resolving it. Because the thing about a blank page is that it is not the kind of detail that admits resolution. It is not a misread sign or a trick of light or the kind of perceptual error that announces itself as an error and releases you from its grip once you have identified it as such. A blank page is a blank page. Either it was blank or she had been wrong about what she saw, and she had been looking at it directly, in adequate light, from a distance of approximately 2 meters for 11 minutes before he turned it, and she had been wrong about very few things she had looked at directly in adequate light from 2 meters for 11 minutes. She drove south on Highway 16 and the tree line moved past on both sides at the speed she was traveling. which was 110 kilometers per hour, the natural speed of this highway in these conditions. And the podcast about cartography was still running and had arrived at the 18th century, and the particular problem of measuring longitude, which she listened to without hearing for several minutes before she turned it off. She wanted quiet. She wanted the specific quality of quiet available inside a moving car on an empty highway, which was not silence but was close enough to silence to allow the kind of thinking she needed to do. Not the deliberate, structured thinking of someone working through a problem, but the looser, more honest thinking that happens when you stop directing it, when you let it go where it needs to go and simply observe where it arrives. It arrived at the boy's face, not the page. She kept moving past the page and arriving at the face, which was the thing she had not yet allowed herself to examine directly, in the way she had not allowed herself to look at the man at the counter directly, until she was already committed to being in the diner, and seated and holding a mug. The boy's face had been reading. This was the only way she could put it. His face had the expression of reading. The particular internal quality of a person who is not fully present in the room they are physically occupying because a portion of their attention is inside a text, navigating its rooms, tracking its movements, responding to its demands. She knew what reading looked like. She had been reading since she was 4 years old, and she had spent 33 years watching other people read, and she knew what it looked like from the outside. The slight softening around the eyes, the loosening of the jaw, the quality of stillness that is different from every other quality of stillness because it contains motion inside it, the motion of a mind moving through a space the body is not in. His face had all of that, and the page had been blank. These two things could not simultaneously be true, and yet they were simultaneously true, and she was driving south on Highway 16 with both hands on the wheel and the trees moving past at 110 kilometers per hour, and she was turning these two simultaneously true things over in her mind, the way you turn a stone over that you know has something under it and are not certain you want to see. At the 53-kilometer mark south of Aldermore, she passed a highway maintenance truck going north, the first vehicle she had encountered since leaving the town, and the presence of the truck, its orange bulk, its flashing amber lights, the brief visual interruption of another moving thing in her field of vision, produced in her a relief so disproportionate to the stimulus that she recognized it immediately as information. She had not, she understood, seen another moving vehicle since she turned off the highway into Aldermore. Not on the two-lane road leading into town, not on the main street, where the two white trucks had been parked and stationary, not on the highway for the 11 minutes and 53 kilometers she had been driving since she left. She had been on a major northern highway on a Tuesday morning in October for nearly an hour, and the highway maintenance truck was the first moving vehicle she had seen. She looked at this fact the way she had looked at the diner, directly in adequate light. Tuesday morning, October. This was a forestry highway, which meant it carried not only passenger traffic but the heavy commercial traffic of the industry. The logging trucks with their chained loads, the fuel tankers, the equipment haulers, the service vehicles of half a dozen related industries that used the highway as their primary artery. She passed this highway 2 or 3 times a year, and she had never, in any season or any weather short of the February road closure, driven 53 kilometers of it without encountering another vehicle. She reached for her phone in the cup holder, which was where she always put it when she was driving, face up, accessible without looking away from the road for more than a second. She called James. He answered on the second ring, which was how James answered, reliably, promptly, with the brisk efficiency of a person who treats phone calls as information exchanges rather than social events, which was one of the things she found genuinely restful about him. He said, "Are you on the road?" She said, "Yes, just south of Vanderhoof." She said this because she needed to say something that was not what she was calling to say. Because she had not yet decided what she was calling to say. Because the thing she was calling to say required a preamble that she was constructing as she spoke. He said, "The Halverson contracts file, you have the signed copies." She said yes, she had them. They were in the folder in her bag on the back seat. He said, "Good, because Halverson called this morning, and they want to move the commencement date forward, and we are going to need to look at the indemnity clause again before we can agree to that." She said she would look at it when she got back. There was a brief pause of the kind that occurs when the business of a call has been concluded, and both parties are deciding whether the call is also concluded. She said, "James, have you driven the 16 recently?" He said, "Not since August. Why?" She said, "Is there anything happening on the highway today? Any closures? Any reason the traffic would be light?" He said, "Not that I know of." "Why, is it bad?" She said, "The opposite, actually." She paused. "I have not seen a vehicle in almost an hour." James, who was a practical man with a practical man's relationship to unexplained phenomena, which was to say, he preferred to explain them and would attempt to do so before entertaining the possibility that they might resist explanation, said that it was Tuesday in October, and that the forestry season was winding down, and that a lot of the commercial traffic would be dropping off this time of year. She said she understood that. She said, "I stopped in Aldermore." She said this the way you say a thing you have been deciding whether to say, with the slight compression of the sentence that comes from having held it back and then released it. James said, "Aldermore." He said it with the particular inflection of someone identifying a word they do not immediately recognize, running it against their internal index and finding either a match or an absence. He said, "Where is that?" She said, "On the Take 16, about 50 kilometers north of where I am now." There was a pause. James said, "Nora, I do not know of a town called Aldermore on the 16th. There is Vanderhoof, and then Fraser Lake, and then nothing significant until you get toward Burns Lake." She said, "It had a diner. A gas station, I think, on the north end of the main street. A hardware store. Maybe 200 residents, perhaps fewer." James said, "I drive the 16 4 times a year, and I have never stopped in anything between Vanderhoof and Fraser Lake, because there is nothing between Vanderhoof and Fraser Lake worth stopping for, which I have always found slightly grim, but there it is." She kept her eyes on the road. She said, "I was just there. I had breakfast there. I have a receipt in my jacket pocket," James said, with the gentle care of someone choosing their words with a precision that was unusual for him, unusual enough for her to notice it. "Are you feeling all right?" she said. "Yes." She said it with the flatness of someone who knows the question behind the question and is answering the question behind the question rather than the one spoken aloud. She said, "I am going to stop at Fraser Lake and look something up." James said, "Good idea. And Nora, drive carefully." She said she would. She ended the call. She drove the remaining distance to Fraser Lake, which took 22 minutes, and she pulled into the parking lot of the first gas station she came to, a large modern one with a Tim Hortons attached, with 4 other vehicles in the lot, and a transport truck at the diesel pumps, and the ordinary active motion of a place that was operating normally in the middle of a Tuesday morning. And she sat in the engine warmth and put her hands in her lap and breathed. Then she took her phone and searched, Aldermore, BC, Highway 16. The search returned results. She leaned forward. The results were for Aldeburgh in Suffolk, England, for Aldermore, Southampton, a residential district, for Aldergrove, BC, which was in the Fraser Valley, 600 kilometers south. There was no Aldermore on Highway 16. She refined the search. She searched Aldermore Family Restaurant, BC. She searched Aldermore, British Columbia, small town. She searched towns between Vanderhoof and Fraser Lake, BC. The results for the last search were consistent and unambiguous. There were no incorporated communities between Vanderhoof and Fraser Lake on Highway 16, a distance of 112 kilometers, a stretch of highway that passed through Crown land and managed forest and offered no services between the two towns. No services. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the receipt. It was there. A small slip of thermal paper, the kind produced by the point-of-sale systems used by small food service businesses throughout the province, printed in the faint graying ink of a thermal roll that was getting toward the end of its life. At the top, Aldermore Family Restaurant. No address. No phone number. Only the name, and then the itemized total below it. Coffee, $2.50. Eggs and toast, $9.75, and the total of $12.25. And below the total, in the space where the machine had calculated and declined her card because she had paid cash, a row of dashes. And below the dashes, in the small font that thermal receipt printers use for footer text, a line she had not read when the receipt printed because she had been focused on placing the cash on the table and getting to the door. She read it now. She read it twice. Then she put the receipt back in her pocket with the careful, deliberate precision of someone handling something they are not sure how to categorize. Something that does not fit any of the existing containers in the organized interior of their mind, and they are setting it aside until a container becomes available. She sat in the parking lot of the Fraser Lake gas station with the engine running, and the Tim Hortons sign reflecting in her windshield, and the transport truck, the diesel pumps, and the 4 other vehicles in the lot, and all of the ordinary Tuesday morning motion of a place that existed without ambiguity, that was on the map, that James knew about, that would appear in her search results without complication. She sat there for a long time. Then she started the car, and she pulled out of the lot, and she drove south. She did not call James back. She did not search anything else on her phone. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road and the trees moving past on both sides at 110 kilometers per hour. And she did not think about the receipt, and she thought about the receipt. The footer text had read, "We are glad U.S." Not, "Thank you for visiting." Not, "Please come again." Not any of the conventional closings that small businesses print at the bottom of their receipts as an automated courtesy, a programmed pleasantry, a piece of commercial warmth inserted into the transaction to make it feel like something other than a transaction. "We are glad, U.S." Past tense on the gladness, present tense on the finding. As though the finding were not something she had done by accident, by hunger, by the unconscious movement of a foot from accelerator to brake on a highway she had driven before, but something that had been in the process of occurring for some time. Something that had been working toward completion, something whose completion they had been waiting for with the patient, entirely still, entirely quiet quality of a room that is waiting for a person to walk into it. She drove south. The highway was empty in both directions for as far as she could see. She reached Whistler Creek at 2:17 in the afternoon. She knew this because she looked at the dashboard clock at the exact moment she passed the town limits sign. The green and white provincial sign with Whistler Creek and the population figure beneath it, 6,140, a number she had passed so many times that she no longer read it consciously, but absorbed it the way you absorb the details of things you encounter every day, the way the familiar becomes invisible through repetition, and she registered the time with the deliberateness of someone who needs a fixed point, a confirmed coordinate, a moment that is unambiguously located in the actual geography of the actual world. 2:17, Whistler Creek. She was here. She parked in the lot behind the office building, which was where she always parked, in the spot closest to the stairwell door, which was where she always parked in that lot. The third space from the left in the second row, the space that was usually available at this hour because the colleague who occasionally took it arrived at 7 and left at 3 and had already gone by the time she returned from trips, and the space was available now, and she pulled into it and stopped the engine and sat. The lot was ordinary. 7 other vehicles, all of them belonging to colleagues she could identify by make and color, and the particular combination of bumper stickers and window decals that personalized them. James's gray Subaru with the BC Park sticker, and the cracked left tail light he had been meaning to replace since August. Sandra from accounting's red Honda with the baby seat visible through the rear window, the company truck that was shared between 3 field staff and that smelled of coffee and survey equipment, and the specific variety of dog hair produced by the yellow lab that one of the field staff brought to work on Fridays. She knew all of these vehicles. She knew them the way she knew her own name and her own face, and the route from her apartment to this parking lot, which was the route she drove every morning without attending to it, without engaging the conscious mind in its navigation, because the navigation had long since been absorbed into the automatic layer of her functioning, where the body handles things that no longer require deliberation. She sat in the car and she looked at them, and they were familiar, and the familiarity was entirely intact, and she felt the specific and disproportionate relief of the familiar for the second time today, the first being the highway maintenance truck, and she noted, as she had noted then, that the relief was information. She was relieved by the familiar because for the past 4 hours she had been inside something that looked like the familiar and was not. She got her bag from the back seat and went upstairs. James was at his desk, which was what James was always doing when she returned from a trip. Not performing work for her benefit, not constructing the appearance of productivity, simply working, because James's relationship to his job was one of the most uncomplicated things about him, and she had always found it steadying in the way that uncomplicated things are steadying when the rest of your day has been the opposite of uncomplicated. He looked up when she came in. He said, "The Halverson file." She took it out of her bag and put it on his desk. He said, "And you are all right." He said it not with the inflection of the earlier question, the careful inflection of someone managing a delicate subject. He said it with the simple directness of someone who has been thinking about a conversation they had on the phone and has decided to continue it. She said, "I want to show you something." She took the receipt from her jacket pocket and put it on his desk beside the Halverson file. He picked it up. He read it. His face did the thing that the faces of methodical people do when they encounter information that does not fit the available categories. Not alarm, not dismissal, but a brief, concentrated stillness, the face version of a pause, the visual equivalent of a mind reaching for its next tool, and finding the toolkit requires examination before the right one can be selected. He said, "Aldermore Family Restaurant." She said, "Yes." He said, "There is no Aldermore on the 16. She said, "I know." He said, "And this receipt is from there." She said, "Yes." He held the receipt and looked at it for a moment more and then set it on the desk with the careful precision of someone setting down something they do not fully understand. And he said, "Sit down, Nora." She sat. He said, "Tell me what happened. All of it, from when you stopped." She told him. She told it in the orderly, sequential way that she told things when she needed to be taken seriously. Not embellished, not minimized, not arranged into a shape that would be easier for the listener to receive, just the sequence of events and observations in the order in which they had occurred, with the details she was certain of, and the things she was less certain of clearly distinguished from each other. The way she would present a contracts issue, the way she had always found that truth worked best when it was delivered without apology for being inconvenient. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to his computer and typed something. and turned the monitor so she could see the screen. He had searched the same things she had searched in the Fraser Lake parking lot and had arrived at the same results. Alderburgh, Aldermore, Southampton, Aldergrove, and then he had searched the BC Geographic Names database, which was a provincial registry of all named places in British Columbia, incorporated and unincorporated, historical and current, including places that had ceased to exist, places whose names had changed, places that appeared on older maps and had been absorbed or abandoned. The search returned no result for Aldermore. He searched the Historical Highway Records database, which was a resource she had not known about, and which he had access to, because one of his previous roles had involved liaison with the Ministry of Transportation, and which contained records of every service community that had ever operated on a provincial highway, including those that had been decommissioned or demolished. No result for Aldermore, he said. It is not in any record I can find. She said, I know, he said, and yet you have a receipt, she said. Yes. He picked up the receipt again and looked at it more closely, and she watched him look, and she watched the moment when he reached the footer text, the moment she had been waiting for, the slight change in his face that was not quite a flinch, but was adjacent to one, the fractional tightening around the eyes that occurred when a person encountered something that the analytical mind had not yet found a place for, and the body was responding to before the analysis was complete. He set the receipt down. He said, "We are glad you U.S." He said it the way she had read it, not as a pleasantry, not with the automatic commercial warmth that the phrase would have carried in other contexts, but as a statement, flat and unornamented, with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said. She said, "Yes." James sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was a thing he did when he was thinking past the edges of his comfort with a subject, when he was in territory that his preference for the practical and explicable had not fully prepared him for, and he was deciding whether to proceed into that territory or to find a route around it. He said, "I want you to drive back," she said. "What?" He said, "I want you to drive back to where Aldermore was, or appeared to be, and I want to go with you, and I want to see whether it is there." She looked at him. She said, "It will be dark in 2 hours." He said, "I know." She said, "And you believe me?" He said this carefully, in the way he said things he had considered. "I believe that you experienced something this morning that does not have a straightforward explanation. And I believe that the receipt is real. And I believe that you are not a person who misreads things you have looked at directly in good light for 11 minutes. He paused. Whether I believe the thing itself is true is a question I would like to investigate before I answer. This was the most James thing she had ever heard him say, and she found it in the way she found most James things, steadying. She said, "All right." They left at 3:10 in James's Subaru, because James had a preference for driving in situations where driving was a practical matter rather than a symbolic one, and he was correct that it was a practical matter. She had been driving since 7:43, and she was tired in the particular way that a day with unusual contents makes you tired. A tiredness that was not physical, but was the tiredness of a mind that had been running its inventory at a heightened level of attention for 6 hours without resolution. She navigated. She told him the kilometer mark where she estimated the Aldermore Junction had been, which was approximately 52 kilometers north of Fraser Lake, and he drove at the steady, slightly below the limit pace that he always drove on unfamiliar roads, the pace of a person for whom arriving intact was categorically more important than arriving quickly. The highway was empty, not as empty as it had been this morning. They passed 3 vehicles in the first 20 kilometers, 2 heading south and 1 heading north, and the presence of other traffic was sufficient to establish that the highway was functioning normally, that the world was continuing to move through it in the ordinary way. She watched the kilometer markers. She said, "It should be coming up." He slowed. The tree line pressed in on both sides, spruce and fir in the particular density of managed crown forest, dark and close and without gaps, and the road ahead curved gently left and then straightened, and the light was going now, the pewter quality of the morning entirely consumed by the flat gray of late October afternoon. Approaching evening, the sky above the tree line the color of old pewter left too long without polishing. She said, "Here, or near here." He pulled to the shoulder and stopped. They both looked. The highway ran straight ahead for perhaps 400 meters before the next curve. On both sides, tree line. No junction. No two-lane road running perpendicular to the highway. No gap in the trees where a road might have been. No gravel lot. No green and white sign. She opened the car door and got out. The air was cold and still and smelled of spruce resin and the particular cold, mineral smell of an October evening approaching dark. And she stood on the shoulder of the highway and looked at the tree line where the junction had been. And she looked at the shoulder itself, at the gravel of the highway margin, at the place where a two-lane road would have intersected with the main highway if a two-lane road had ever been there. The gravel was undisturbed, not recently disturbed and smoothed over, undisturbed in the deep sense, in the sense of gravel that has been accumulating its particular arrangement of stones and compressed earth over years, without the compression of tires or the cutting of a road edge, or any of the marks that a junction leaves on a highway shoulder, even long after the junction has been closed. There was no sign that a road had ever been here. James got out and stood beside her. He looked at what she was looking at. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he crouched down and looked at the shoulder gravel closely, the way he looked at contract language closely, with the same unhurried precision. And he stood up and looked at the tree line, and he said, "The trees are the same age on both sides." She said, "What?" he said. If there had been a road here, even a historic one, even one cleared and then abandoned, the trees in the clearing zone would be younger than the surrounding forest. Secondary growth. They would be visibly different, thinner, more uniform in height, a different density. He looked at the trees. He said, "These trees are the same age on both sides of where you said the junction was. This forest has not been cut here. Not in the last 40 or 50 years at minimum." She stood on the highway shoulder in the cold October evening and looked at the trees that had not been cut, and she looked at the gravel that had not been disturbed, and she felt the wrongness from the morning settle into something new, something with a different shape. Not the unsettling, floating quality of this morning, which had been the wrongness of a world that was off by a degree she could not measure, but something denser and more vertical, something with weight. James straightened and put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the road ahead, and then he looked at the road behind. And then he said, with the quietness of someone who has been turning something over for a long time and has decided it is time to say it, "Nora," she said. "Yes," he said. "How did you know to turn off here?" She had not thought about this. She had told him she had turned off because she was mildly hungry, because the muffin had been some time ago, because she had noticed the sign and turned without making a decision to turn. And she had believed this account, had offered it to herself in the Fraser Lake parking lot as the sufficient explanation for the foot moving from accelerator to brake. She thought about it now. She thought about the moment before the turn, the moment on the highway, approaching the junction that was not there, and she tried to locate in her memory of that moment the specific sensory event that had caused her foot to move, the sign she had read, the building she had glimpsed through a gap in the trees, the smell of food or coffee carried on the air through a cracked window. Any of the ordinary triggers that cause a driver to notice a service community and make the decision to stop. She could not locate it. She remembered the turn. She remembered the two-lane road and the gravel lot and the green and white sign and the flat pewter light. She could not remember the moment before any of that. She could not remember seeing the junction from the highway. She could not remember reading the sign from the road. She could not remember deciding. She said, "I do not know." James looked at her. He said, "All right." He said it with the completeness of someone who has received an answer that has answered more than the question it was given in response to. Someone who has asked where the road is and been told, in the most honest possible way, that the road does not lead back from where it led to, that some junctions only run in one direction, that the map of the way out and the map of the way in are not the same map. He said, "Let us go back." She said yes. They got in the car. He turned the Subaru around on the empty highway and drove south, and the headlights came on automatically as the last of the light left the sky, and they drove in the warmth of the car with the dark pressing in on both sides, and neither of them spoke for a long time. At the 30-kilometer mark south of the place where Aldermore had been, or had appeared to be, or had arranged itself to be found, she put her hand in her jacket pocket. The receipt was still there. She did not take it out. She held it between her fingers through the fabric of the pocket, the thin, waxy slip of thermal paper, and she felt the text on its surface the way you can sometimes feel text if the print is deep enough and the paper is thin enough and you are paying close enough attention. Not read it, just feel the fact of it, the impression of language in a material, the evidence that something had been here and had left a mark. "We are glad U.S." She thought about the cartographers of the 16th century, who had drawn coastlines they had never seen with the confident precision of people who had been there, who had sailed those waters and returned with measurements, who knew the shape of the world's edge. She thought about the edges of maps. She thought about what the cartographers had put there, in the space beyond the known. Sometimes nothing, sometimes monsters, sometimes the confident false line of a coast that was pure conjecture. And sometimes she remembered from the podcast she had turned off 11 minutes after leaving Aldermore. Sometimes they had written simply, "Here there be unknowns," not monsters, not nothing, unknowns. As though the most honest thing a person could say about the edge of the world they understood was not that it was empty, and not that it was dangerous, but simply that it was there, that something was there, that the map ran out before the world did, and the world continued regardless, without the map's permission, in whatever shape it had decided to take. She held the receipt through the fabric of her pocket and looked out the window at the dark pressing in on both sides of the road, and she thought about a room where the windows had been closed for a very long time, and a blank page that a boy had been reading for 11 minutes, and a woman who walked without turning her head, and two women whose mouths moved without sound, and a man who faced her without looking at her, and food that was correct and did not mean food. She thought about the footer text. "We are glad you found us," she thought. Found. Not visited, not stopped at, not stumbled upon, found. As though she had been looking, without knowing she was looking, for longer than this morning, longer perhaps than this drive. As though the finding was the conclusion of something that had been in progress for some time, that had been moving toward this particular junction, on this particular highway, on this particular October morning, with the patient, entirely still, entirely quiet inevitability of something that knew how to wait. James drove south. The highway was empty ahead of them as far as the headlights reached, which was not very far, which was the nature of headlights on a dark road. They showed you the next small portion of the way forward and nothing beyond it, and you drove into that portion and the next portion lit up, and you drove into that, and so on, always in the light and always at the edge of the dark, always exactly as far as you could see and no further. She thought, what if it is not finished? She thought, what if found is not past tense? She thought, what if found is the wrong word entirely, and the right word is finding, and the finding is still in progress? and the junction is not behind her but ahead, somewhere in the dark beyond the reach of the headlights, waiting at a curve in the road she has not yet come to, with its flat pewter light and its green and white sign and its diner full of people who are very still and very quiet and have been waiting, in the particular patient way of things that do not need to rush, for the foot to move from the accelerator to the brake. She did not say any of this to James. She looked at the road ahead. She looked at the dark beyond the headlights. She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "Do not stop anywhere on the way back." He looked at her briefly, then back at the road. He said, "I was not planning to." She said, "Good." She took her hand out of her jacket pocket. She did not touch the receipt again. The car moved south through the dark, and the portions of road lit and went dark behind them, and the tree line held its position on both sides, and nothing moved in it, and nothing came at them from the north, and the highway unrolled in front of the headlights in the measured, sequential way that highways unroll when everything is as it should be. She watched the road. She watched the dark at the edges of the headlights. She watched the place where the light ended and the dark began, where the known ran out and the unknown continued, where the map had nothing more to say, and the world went on regardless. Nothing came out of it. Nothing came out of it, she breathed. She watched.